The Chocolate Poisoner, Christiana Edmunds and the Crime That Terrified Victorian England. Written by Alana Sanchez. Narrated by Ivy. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. This book began with a question that Victorian England never satisfactorily answered. How could a respectable woman poison strangers in public, and believe herself morally justified in doing so? In 1871, the seaside town of Brighton was gripped by fear. Chocolates, symbols of affection, leisure, and childhood indulgence, were suddenly suspect. Children collapsed in convulsions. Adults fell violently ill. The poison was strychnine, and the hand that delivered it belonged not to a disgruntled laborer, a political radical, or a criminal known to police, but to a quiet, educated, middle-class woman, Christiana Edmunds. She did not kill for money. She did not kill for survival. She did not kill in secret. Instead, Edmunds poisoned indiscriminately, calmly reintroducing tainted chocolates into shops and postal systems, fully aware that her victims might be children, strangers, or the entirely innocent. She did so not out of chaos or impulse, but with deliberation, and with a conviction that her actions served a higher emotional purpose. Victorian newspapers called her mad. The courts confined her as insane. History, for the most part, reduced her to a footnote, the Brighton chocolate poisoner. Yet these explanations are insufficient. Madness, when used as a full stop rather than a question mark, tells us very little. This book does not ask whether Christiana Edmunds was legally insane. It asks something more unsettling: how a woman shaped entirely by Victorian respectability, restraint, and moral instruction came to see poisoning the public as a rational extension of love, grievance, and entitlement. Unlike many figures in true crime, Edmunds left behind no childhood marked by brutality, no early record of violence, no trail of scandal. Her early life was orderly, unremarkable, and socially approved. That ordinariness is precisely what makes her story disturbing, and worth examining at length. She was not an outsider to Victorian society. She was its product. This manuscript approaches Edmunds not as a curiosity, but as a case study in emotional repression, gendered powerlessness, and the dangerous alchemy of obsession and fantasy. It situates her crimes within the realities of 19th-century womanhood: limited agency, rigid moral codes, the precarious position of unmarried women, and a legal system deeply uncertain about how to judge female violence. Where the historical record is silent, this book does not invent. Where it is ambiguous, it remains honest about uncertainty. Speculation is clearly marked and grounded in social, psychological, and cultural context. Sensation is resisted in favor of understanding, not to excuse Edmunds but to explain her. This is not a book about chocolates. It is not even solely a book about poison. It is a book about how a woman learned to disappear in plain sight, how desire curdled into grievance, and how a society unprepared to recognize female malice chose to call it madness and lock it away. Christiana Edmunds spent more than 3 decades confined at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. By the time she died in 1907, the world that created her was already vanishing. What remains is a question that still unsettles us. What happens when a person is taught to suppress every form of power except the one that harms? This book is an attempt to answer that question, carefully, rigorously, and without looking away. Chapter 1. A Respectable Beginning. Christiana Edmunds was born into a world that prized order above all else. She entered life in 1828, in the early decades of the 19th century, when England was tightening its moral spine in response to industrial change, urban growth, and social unease. Her birth went unremarked by history, recorded only in parish registers and census returns, yet it placed her squarely within a class that believed itself the custodian of civilization, the respectable middle class. The precise location of her birth remains uncertain. Most surviving records point to Margate in Kent, though her family would later establish themselves in Brighton, another coastal town favored by those aspiring to gentility. This uncertainty is emblematic of Edmunds' early life. She did not emerge from obscurity so much as from normality, a normality so complete that it left little documentary trace. Her father was a builder and contractor, a profession that carried neither the stigma of manual labor nor the privilege of inherited wealth. He was a man who worked with his hands and his accounts, bridging the worlds of labor and respectability. Builders in this period occupied a curious social position, essential to the expanding towns of southern England, yet perpetually anxious to distinguish themselves from the working poor. Respectability was not assumed. It had to be earned, displayed, and defended. In such households, children learned early that appearance mattered. Cleanliness, composure, and good behavior were not merely virtues. They were safeguards against social dissent. There is no evidence that Christiana's father was cruel or indulgent. What can be said with confidence is that he belonged to a generation of men for whom emotional reserve was equated with moral strength. Affection, if expressed at all, was measured and restrained. Of Christiana's mother, the historical record is almost entirely silent. This absence is not unusual. Middle-class women left few traces unless they transgressed. Yet silence itself speaks. Mothers were expected to be ever present within the home and yet invisible beyond it, shaping their daughters through example rather than instruction. From her mother, Christiana would have learned the grammar of femininity: modesty, obedience, restraint, and above all, self-control. The Edmunds household was not marked by deprivation or disorder. There are no surviving accounts of violence, addiction, or scandal. This is important. Victorian society was quick to attribute female criminality to moral corruption or hereditary taint. In Christiana Edmunds' case, there is no such convenient explanation. Her upbringing appears to have been stable, structured, and socially approved. Christiana was, by all contemporary indications, an intelligent girl. Later in life, she would demonstrate fluency in language, a capacity for sustained argument, and a careful attention to detail. These traits were not accidental. They were the products of an education that prized articulation and decorum. Reading was encouraged, provided it remained edifying. Emotional intensity, by contrast, was something to be moderated or suppressed. Childhood in early 19th century England was not sentimental in the modern sense. Children were expected to learn self-discipline early. Displays of anger, jealousy, or excessive attachment were discouraged, particularly in girls. A young woman's value lay in her composure, her ability to be agreeable, contained, and untroubling. Within this framework, Christiana learned to observe rather than to act. She learned to watch, to wait, and to internalize. Indeed, it is likely that she was the opposite: quiet, compliant, and unremarkable. Such girls rarely drew attention from teachers or neighbors. They did not appear in letters or diaries because there was nothing to note. Yet the absence of conflict does not indicate the absence of feeling. Victorian domesticity demanded that emotion be carefully managed, particularly for women. Desire, resentment, and anger were not eliminated. They were redirected inward. Over time, this inward turn could foster an intense private life, rich in fantasy and rumination, untested by contradiction. As Christiana moved toward adolescence, the boundaries of her world narrowed rather than expanded. Opportunities available to her brothers, if she had them, would not have been available to her. Her future was envisaged in limited terms: marriage or, failing that, dependence. There was no recognized space for female autonomy, intellectual or emotional. This narrowing was not unique to Christiana Edmunds. It was a structural feature of her society. Yet for some women, these constraints merely produced conformity. For others, they generated a quiet pressure that sought release in less visible ways. By the time Christiana reached her teens, she had absorbed the lessons of her class thoroughly. She knew how to behave, how to speak, how to disappear into respectability. What she had not been taught was how to negotiate disappointment, rejection, or unreciprocated desire. These were emotions for which Victorian culture offered no legitimate vocabulary to women. The seeds of Christiana Edmunds' later actions were not planted in cruelty or chaos. They were planted in silence. Chapter 2. Cultivated Minds and Quiet Lives. If Christiana Edmunds learned early how to be invisible, she also learned how to be accomplished. By the standards of her class and time, she was well educated. This much is evident from the fragments that survive of her adult life: letters that were coherent and controlled, speech that was articulate, and reasoning that followed a deliberate, ordered logic. Contemporary reporters noted her intelligence, often with faint astonishment, as though the presence of intellect in a criminal woman required special remark. Intelligence, however, was not unusual among middle-class Victorian women. What mattered was how it was contained. There are no surviving school records that identify precisely where Christiana was educated, but the likely shape of her schooling can be reconstructed with confidence. Middle-class girls in the 1830s and 1840s were typically educated either at home by a governess or at small private academies for young ladies. These were not institutions designed to foster independence or ambition. Their purpose was cultivation, to produce women who were informed, pleasant, and morally reliable. What she was not taught is just as significant. Girls were not encouraged to argue openly, to express anger, or to imagine futures not anchored in marriage or family dependence. Education sharpened perception but discouraged action. It trained women to think clearly while offering them little legitimate space in which to act on their thoughts. Christiana appears to have suited this environment. There is no indication that she struggled academically or was regarded as troublesome. On the contrary, her later ability to plan carefully, to manipulate systems, and to articulate her own justifications suggests a woman accustomed to sustained thought and private reasoning. Yet this thinking developed in a culture that discouraged emotional disclosure. Feelings were to be mastered, not explored. Books were one of the few pleasures openly sanctioned for girls of Christiana's class. While no catalogue of her reading survives, the literary environment of the time offers strong clues. Novels steeped in sentiment and moral struggle were popular, as were poetry, religious tracts, and improving literature. Such reading could be expansive and constricting at once. It offered imaginative escape while reinforcing idealized notions of love, devotion, and moral destiny. For a reflective child, books could become companions more dependable than people. They allowed feelings to be rehearsed safely internally without the risks of exposure or contradiction. There is reason to believe that Christiana developed a rich inner life early on. Her later obsessional thinking did not emerge suddenly in middle age. It was more likely the culmination of years spent turning inward, elaborating emotional narratives that were never tested against reality. Perhaps the most striking feature of Christiana's early life is the absence of documented friendships. No childhood companions appear in the record. No school friends later spoke of her temperament. No correspondence with peers survives. This silence does not prove that she had no friends, but it suggests that her relationships, if they existed, were not enduring or emotionally central. Victorian girls often formed intense friendships with other girls, sometimes expressed in language of devotion and exclusivity. These bonds could be emotionally sustaining, but they were also fragile, frequently disrupted by marriage, relocation, or family obligation. If Christiana experienced such friendships, they left no trace. No confidant emerges later in her life. No figure who might have challenged her perceptions or interrupted her private reasoning. This absence would matter profoundly in adulthood. When Christiana later became consumed by obsession, there was no trusted voice to contradict her interpretations, no social anchor strong enough to pull her back toward proportion. As she moved through adolescence, the horizon of possibility narrowed rather than widened. For Victorian girls, education ended not because learning was complete, but because its purpose was assumed to have been served. What followed was an ambiguous period, particularly for those who did not marry quickly. A young woman could find herself suspended between girlhood and usefulness, her value increasingly measured by what she lacked. There is no evidence that Christiana attracted serious suitors in her youth. Nor is there evidence that she was actively prevented from marrying. The absence suggests something more elusive. A woman who did not easily inspire attachment, or who herself struggled to form it in socially acceptable ways. Victorian culture allowed women to desire marriage, but not to pursue it overtly. Desire had to remain passive, modest, and unspoken. For someone who felt deeply or attached intensely, this created an emotional impasse. Feelings could be acknowledged only after they were reciprocated. Rejection, when it came, had to be absorbed silently, without protest or explanation. Christiana's interests appear to have been conventional. She moved comfortably within the routines of respectable life: shopping, correspondence, social visits, church attendance. Later, she would demonstrate a striking familiarity with poisons, but this knowledge likely came from domestic medicine and popular literature rather than formal study. Victorian households commonly kept substances such as strychnine for pest control, and women were often responsible for minor medical care within the home. Knowledge of poison was not unusual. What was unusual was how she would later use it. Perhaps the most consequential gap in Christiana Edmunds' upbringing was not educational but emotional. She was never taught how to manage rejection, how to negotiate desire ethically, or how to accept disappointment without transforming it into grievance. Victorian moral instruction emphasized duty and restraint, but offered little guidance on emotional resilience. In such an environment, feelings did not disappear. They intensified in private. Fantasy became safer than confession. Interpretation replaced dialogue. Over time, imagined narratives could acquire more emotional authority than lived experience. By the end of her adolescence, Christiana Edmunds had become a woman who thought carefully, felt intensely, and lived cautiously. She had learned to present herself as calm, reasonable, and respectable. What she had not learned was how to endure the ordinary failures of intimacy without reimagining them as injustice. Chapter 3. Brighton and the Shape of Longing. By the time Christiana Edmunds entered full adulthood, her life had settled into a pattern that Victorian society regarded as unremarkable and therefore safe. She did not marry. She did not pursue paid employment. She did not withdraw into family service or religious vocation. Instead, she lived quietly on private means, occupying that broad and largely unexamined social category of unmarried middle-class women whose respectability rested on financial modesty, emotional restraint, and the absence of visible need. There is no evidence that Christiana Edmunds ever worked in any recognized occupation. She was not a governess, nor a companion, nor a teacher, nor a shop assistant. She did not take in lodgers or advertise services. Her days were not structured by labor, and no employer ever accounted for her time. This absence is not accidental. It places her squarely within a familiar Victorian arrangement. A daughter supported by family provision, likely supplemented by a small inheritance or annuity. Her father's career as a builder and contractor would have provided steady income rather than wealth, but men in this position often made careful provision for unmarried daughters. It was common to set aside savings, investments, or insurance payments to ensure that a daughter could live respectably without working, should marriage not occur. Christiana appears to have been one of these women. She did not live lavishly, but neither did she display signs of financial strain. She paid rent, maintained a household, shopped regularly, and made discretionary purchases without apparent difficulty. This kind of income was quietly restrictive. It preserved gentility while enforcing dependence. Christiana had enough money to live alone, but not enough to travel widely, pursue interests beyond the domestic sphere, or reinvent herself socially. Her independence was real but narrow. It was this narrow independence that made Brighton such a logical destination. By the middle of the 19th century, Brighton had become a town of people exactly like Christiana Edmunds. Widows, retired professionals, unmarried daughters, and families living on fixed incomes filled its streets and lodging houses. It was cheaper than London, more socially fluid than smaller provincial towns, and deeply invested in appearances. One could live alone there without inviting gossip, provided one adhered to the rituals of respectability. Christiana's move to Brighton was almost certainly gradual rather than dramatic. She may have arrived with family initially, or relocated after the death of a parent, when remaining in the family home was no longer practical. What matters is not the precise date of her arrival, but the fit between her circumstances and the town itself. Brighton offered anonymity without isolation. She could be surrounded by people of her own class without being closely known by any of them. Her accommodation appears to have been modest, rented rooms or a small house rather than a family property. This was typical of the town's residential culture. Brighton was full of lodging houses designed for genteel residents who wished to avoid both domestic servitude and overt dependence on relatives. Such arrangements encouraged privacy, routine, and emotional self-containment. Christiana's days followed a predictable rhythm. She shopped for household goods, attended church, wrote letters, and walked the streets and promenade. Leisure was structured, not indulgent. There were shops to browse, but few commitments that demanded engagement. Time passed quietly, largely unmarked. This abundance of unstructured time mattered. Without the demands of work or family care, Christiana's inner life had space to expand unchecked. Routine provided order but not meaning. For a woman already inclined toward introspection, this could deepen habits of rumination rather than disrupt them. It was within this context that Christiana encountered Dr. Charles Beard, a local physician whose profession, manner, and social position embodied the ideals Victorian women were taught to admire. He was educated, authoritative, and married, respectable in every visible way. The details of their initial interaction are unclear, but the emotional significance Christiana attached to it is not. Beard's attention, however ordinary or professionally courteous it may have been, assumed disproportionate importance in Christiana's private world. Years of emotional restraint had taught her to interpret rather than to inquire, to construct meaning internally rather than seek clarification. Polite interest became intimacy. Familiarity became promise. When Beard attempted to withdraw or impose boundaries as propriety required, Christiana did not experience this as a neutral correction. She experienced it as injury. Rejection, when one has never been taught how to process it openly, can feel like betrayal. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation hardens into conviction. Her financial and social circumstances now became crucial. Christiana was accountable to no one. She did not answer to a husband, an employer, or a family member overseeing her habits. She could move through the town freely, visiting shops, chemists, and post offices without scrutiny. Her purchases required no explanation. Her time belonged entirely to her. Brighton itself facilitated what followed. Its shops were numerous and anonymous. Chemists sold poisons with limited oversight, particularly substances commonly used for pest control. Chocolates, symbols of affection, leisure, and genteel exchange, circulated freely through the town. They could be bought, returned, gifted, and resold without comment. Christiana's actions emerged gradually from this environment. They were not the product of desperation or poverty, but of entitlement shaped by isolation. She did not perceive herself as a criminal. She perceived herself as wronged. The suffering of strangers was not central in her moral reasoning. It was incidental. Her income sustained her physical independence. Brighton sustained her anonymity. Her upbringing had sustained her silence. Together they created the conditions in which imagination could eclipse reality, and grievance could justify harm. Christiana Edmunds did not fall through the cracks of Victorian society. She occupied one of its most stable positions, the respectable, self-supporting single woman. That position shielded her from suspicion even as it granted her the freedom to act. Chapter 4. Chocolates, Poison, and Permission. The first poisoned chocolates did not announce themselves as a crime. By then, Christiana Edmunds had already crossed a threshold she would never acknowledge as such. The decision to poison chocolates was not impulsive. It emerged from sustained thought, repetition, and rehearsal. 4 months, perhaps longer, she had lived inside a private narrative of grievance that justified action without ever naming it as violence. What she contemplated was not murder but correction, a means of forcing a moral realignment in a world that had wronged her. Strychnine was readily available. It was commonly used to kill rats and other vermin, and its sale was regulated loosely, if at all. Chemists might record purchases, but buying poison did not carry the automatic suspicion it would later acquire. Respectable women were assumed to act in the interests of domestic order. Their transactions were rarely questioned. Chocolates, meanwhile, were ubiquitous. By the 1870s, confectionery had become a staple of middle-class leisure. Chocolates were bought for children, exchanged between friends, and offered as tokens of affection. They were intimate without being improper, personal without being explicit. They occupied a moral gray space that suited her purposes perfectly. She bought chocolates from Brighton shops, took them home, and altered them. The process was careful rather than crude. When the first victims fell ill, the symptoms were dramatic. Strychnine acts quickly, producing violent convulsions, muscle rigidity, and intense distress. Those affected often remained conscious, aware of their own suffering. In at least one instance, a child collapsed after consuming what should have been a harmless treat. Doctors were initially baffled. Food poisoning was suspected, then dismissed. Individual cases appeared unconnected. No one wanted to believe that an everyday luxury had become a weapon. Christiana followed developments closely. She read newspaper accounts, noted public reaction, and tracked the spread of unease through the town. This attention did not deter her, it encouraged her. Each new report reinforced the reality of her influence. She was no longer imagining consequence, she was producing it. What unsettled Brighton's medical men was not only the violence of the symptoms, but their similarity. Convulsions, rigidity, rapid onset. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. Gradually, the possibility of deliberate poisoning took hold. Once raised, it could not be dismissed. Chemists and confectioners were quietly alerted. They were asked to be observant, to note repeat customers, unusual purchases, or the return of goods that seemed irregular. This was not yet a formal investigation so much as a widening net of professional unease. Victorian policing often relied on community observation long before arrests were contemplated. It was here that Christiana's habits, once invisible, began to register. She had purchased chocolates repeatedly, sometimes returning them under vague pretenses. She was also known to buy strychnine ostensibly for domestic use. Neither act alone was remarkable. Together and repeated, they began to form a pattern. Chemists remembered her not because she was strange but because she was consistent. She did not attempt to disguise her identity or vary her routine. She was polite, composed, and unhurried. This consistency, which had protected her earlier, now worked against her. Patterns became visible precisely because she believed her respectability rendered her beyond suspicion. The police became involved as medical consensus hardened. Investigators proceeded cautiously. Accusing a respectable woman of mass poisoning was an extraordinary step, and Victorian authorities were acutely aware of the social consequences of error. Statements were taken from shopkeepers. Purchase records were examined. Timelines were compared. A critical shift occurred when attention turned to Christiana's correspondence. She had written a series of letters to Dr. Charles Beard that, when viewed alongside the poisonings, took on a new significance. Some were imploring, others accusatory, several erratic in tone. A number suggested knowledge of events before they were publicly reported. What she likely perceived as emotional candor appeared, to investigators, as proximity. Her public behavior also began to seem oddly revealing. She discussed the poisonings freely, displayed intense interest, and sometimes possessed details that exceeded what newspapers had disclosed. To those already uneasy, this familiarity was troubling. Once suspicion settled, the case accelerated. Witness testimony placed her repeatedly in relevant shops. Chemists identified her as a purchaser of strychnine. The cumulative weight of small observations, none decisive alone, became overwhelming together. When Christiana Edmunds was arrested, the shock was profound. Even those who had grown suspicious struggled to reconcile the calm, well-spoken woman before them with the scale of harm caused. She did not resist. She did not collapse. She explained. Her explanations were measured and internally coherent. She framed her actions not as crimes but as responses to injury. She spoke at length, rationally and without visible remorse, about grievance and justification, while remaining curiously detached from the suffering of her victims. To Victorian ears, this combination was deeply unsettling. It did not align neatly with vice, desperation, or cruelty. Chemists who had served her were shaken. They had not been negligent by the standards of the time, yet ordinary transactions had enabled extraordinary harm. The case exposed the fragility of systems built on trust, and how easily that trust could be exploited by those who appeared most trustworthy. Christiana had not evaded detection through brilliance or disguise. She had relied on assumption, on the belief that a respectable, financially independent woman could not be capable of such acts. That belief delayed suspicion long enough for fear to spread through the town. By the time the case reached the courts, the question was no longer simply what she had done. It was what she was. The poisoned chocolates had forced Brighton to confront an uncomfortable truth. Danger could arrive wrapped in paper and ribbon, purchased with exact change and returned politely to the counter. Chapter 5. Reasonable Doubt and Unreasonable Minds. From the moment Christiana Edmunds entered the machinery of the law, her case was never treated as an ordinary criminal prosecution. The evidence against her was substantial and, by Victorian standards, persuasive. Purchases of strychnine could be traced. Shopkeepers identified her as a repeat customer. Letters linked her emotionally and temporally to the events. Witnesses placed her in proximity to poisoned chocolates. Yet almost immediately, another question intruded, one that shaped every stage of the investigation and ultimately eclipsed the question of guilt. Was Christiana Edmunds sane? This question did not arise after conviction, nor as a last-minute stratagem by defense counsel. It emerged early, voiced by police, doctors, and legal authorities who found themselves confronting something that did not fit comfortably within existing categories of crime. Her behavior was deliberate, sustained, and purposeful, yet her reasoning appeared grotesquely disproportionate to her actions. During police questioning, Edmunds did not deny involvement in the poisoning. Instead, she spoke at length about motive and justification. She explained her actions calmly, often rationally, but with a moral logic that appeared detached from shared reality. She framed herself as injured, betrayed, and compelled to act. The suffering of victims, many of them strangers, featured only marginally in her explanations. To modern readers, this may resemble obsessional or delusional thinking. To Victorian authorities, it raised immediate concern. The 19th century was deeply invested in categorizing insanity, particularly when criminal behavior could not be easily explained by greed, rage, or desperation. Edmunds' composure unnerved those who encountered her. She was not incoherent. She was not hysterical. She did not conform to popular caricatures of madness. Doctors were consulted early. Medical examination in this period relied heavily on observation rather than diagnosis in the modern sense. Physicians assessed demeanor, speech patterns, consistency of thought, and emotional responsiveness. Edmunds presented as lucid and articulate, but her fixed beliefs, particularly regarding Dr. Charles Beard and her sense of moral entitlement, were difficult to reconcile with sanity as Victorians understood it. There is clear historical evidence that Edmunds was considered mentally unsound before her trial commenced. Police reports and medical opinions converged on the view that, while she understood the nature of her actions, her reasoning was governed by what was then termed moral insanity, a concept widely debated in 19th-century psychiatry. Moral insanity did not imply intellectual impairment. Rather, it described individuals whose reasoning faculties appeared intact, but whose moral judgment and emotional regulation were profoundly disordered. Such people could plan, articulate, and execute complex actions while remaining incapable of recognizing their ethical implications. This diagnosis was controversial even at the time. Critics argued that it excused criminal behavior under the guise of science. Supporters maintained that it accounted for cases where behavior was too purposeful to be dismissed as madness, yet too irrational to be explained by ordinary vice. Christiana Edmunds became a textbook example. During the investigation, her letters were scrutinized closely. They revealed a pattern of obsessive attachment, emotional volatility, and grandiose justification. In several letters, she hinted at knowledge of the poisonings before details were publicly known. In others, she framed herself as a victim of injustice whose suffering demanded redress. The tone oscillated between self-pity and moral certainty, reinforcing the impression of a fixed, self-referential worldview. Importantly, Edmunds did not attempt to conceal her reasoning. She seemed genuinely convinced of its legitimacy. This transparency troubled investigators more than outright deception would have. A calculating criminal might lie, Edmunds explained. By the time her case reached court, the prosecution and defense were aligned on one point. She was not a woman acting out of ordinary criminal intent. The disagreement lay in how that fact should be treated. Should she be punished or confined? Victorian courts were deeply ambivalent about women who committed serious violence. Female offenders challenged assumptions about passivity, nurturance, and moral superiority. When such women appeared calm, articulate, and purposeful, the discomfort intensified. Madness became a culturally acceptable framework through which female violence could be contained and explained. At trial, expert medical testimony emphasized Edmunds' delusional beliefs, her obsessive fixation, and her inability to appreciate the consequences of her actions in a morally meaningful way. She was described as suffering from a diseased mind, even as she demonstrated intellectual competence. The distinction mattered. It allowed the court to acknowledge the reality of her actions while absolving her of full criminal responsibility. The verdict reflected this compromise. Christiana Edmunds was found guilty but insane. This outcome spared her execution, a sentence that would almost certainly have been imposed on a man convicted of similar crimes. Instead, she was ordered to be confined during Her Majesty's pleasure, a phrase that masked the reality of what followed. There was no fixed term, no clear path to release. Confinement for the criminally insane was often lifelong. The investigation into Christiana Edmunds did more than identify a perpetrator. It exposed the limits of Victorian understanding of crime, of sanity, and of female agency. Authorities could prove what she had done. What they struggled to articulate was why, and whether that why belonged to the domain of law or medicine. Chapter 6. Broadmoor and the Long Containment. Christiana Edmunds arrived at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum in 1871, not as a woman newly discovered to be dangerous, but as one already carefully classified. By the time she crossed its gates, the state had reached two firm conclusions: that she could not be safely released into society, and that she could not be punished as an ordinary criminal. Broadmoor existed precisely for people like her, those whose actions were undeniably harmful, yet whose minds were judged to operate according to a logic that law alone could not contain. Opened in 1863, Broadmoor was Britain's first institution purpose-built for the criminally insane. It was intended to be neither prison nor hospital, but something uneasily balanced between the two. Its architecture reflected this ambiguity. High walls and locked wards softened by landscaped grounds, moral instruction and the language of care. Patients were inmates, but they were also long-term subjects of scrutiny. Christiana was admitted following her verdict of guilty but insane at the age of 43. Her arrival was carefully documented. Female patients were relatively few, and women convicted of crimes involving indiscriminate public harm were rarer still. From the beginning, her case was regarded as unusual. Medical officers recorded her demeanor as calm, orderly, and composed. She understood where she was and why she had been sent there. She spoke clearly and rationally without agitation or confusion. There were no hallucinations, no disorientation, no intellectual impairment. This lucidity immediately complicated her classification. She did not resemble the chaotic or distressed patients who populated popular images of insanity. Her behavior inside Broadmoor remained consistently controlled. She complied with institutional rules, followed routines without protest, and showed no inclination toward disruption or defiance. There are no records of violent outbursts, disciplinary measures, or attempts to abscond. She was not a troublesome patient. In many respects, she was an exemplary one. Christiana participated in the work assigned to female patients, which typically involved sewing, needlework, laundry, and other domestic tasks regarded as stabilizing. She performed these duties reliably and without complaint. Staff noted her diligence and neatness. Routine appeared to suit her. The structure of asylum life mirrored, in exaggerated form, the ordered domestic existence she had led outside its walls. Her interactions with staff were polite and measured. She was neither ingratiating nor hostile. Doctors observed that she engaged readily in conversation, answered questions thoughtfully, and demonstrated sustained attention and memory. She did not resist examination or observation. On the contrary, she often seemed eager to explain herself. It was in these explanations that her continued pathology was most evident. Despite decades of confinement, Christiana did not meaningfully revise her understanding of her crimes. She continued to frame her actions as responses to injury and betrayal, rather than as acts of violence against innocent people. She spoke of grievance and injustice with clarity and conviction, while remaining strikingly detached from the suffering she had caused. Medical notes repeatedly remarked on this imbalance. Her emotional responses were described as limited and self-referential. She expressed distress about her own situation, her confinement, and her perceived mistreatment, but rarely, if ever, articulated remorse for her victims. This absence was not dramatic. It was quiet, consistent, and persistent. Doctors struggled to interpret this combination of intellectual competence and emotional distortion. Over time, their language shifted. Early entries refer to delusion and moral defect. Later notes speak more cautiously of fixed ideas, emotional coldness, and incurability. Christiana did not deteriorate under confinement, but neither did she improve in ways that suggested recovery or insight. Her correspondence was tightly controlled. Letters were permitted but read and censored. In them she remained articulate and composed. She wrote of endurance, misunderstanding, and injustice. She did not display confusion or incoherence. Once again, what was most notable was what was absent: empathy for others, acknowledgement of harm, or recognition of moral responsibility. This consistency troubled her doctors more than instability would have. Christiana's calm behavior did not reassure them. It suggested that she could function smoothly within rules while retaining the same internal logic that had once justified poisoning the public. Good behavior in her case was not evidence of safety. As the years passed, Christiana Edmunds became a permanent feature of Broadmoor. Staff changed. Superintendents came and went. Treatment philosophies evolved. She remained. Her case notes accumulated observations rather than conclusions. She was not neglected, but she was no longer actively treated in any curative sense. She was managed. Requests for discharge were never seriously entertained. Broadmoor's standards for release were strict, particularly for patients whose crimes involved public danger and whose mental states were judged fixed. Christiana's composure was interpreted not as recovery, but as proof of continued risk. She lived this way for 36 years. Christiana Edmunds died at Broadmoor in 1907, having spent the greater part of her adult life within its walls. She outlived the public panic she caused, the doctors who first examined her, and many of the legal and psychiatric theories that shaped her confinement. The Victorian world that produced her had largely vanished by the time of her death. She did not. Her behavior at Broadmoor forces an uncomfortable reckoning. She was not wild, incoherent, or visibly unwell. She was calm, capable, and contained. The institution did not correct her reasoning. It neutralized its consequences. Christiana Edmunds was never cured. She was never released. She was never reconciled to the harm she caused. Chapter 7. Dr. Charles Beard and the Life He Kept. Charles Beard is often reduced in retellings of the chocolate poisonings to a plot function. The married doctor, the object of fixation, the man at the center of Christiana Edmunds' private universe. But Beard was also a Victorian professional with a career to protect, a household to stabilize, and a public identity built, like so many men's in that period, on the appearance of composure. To understand what happened after Edmunds was removed from Brighton and swallowed by Broadmoor, it helps to begin with what Beard represented before the case: legitimacy. He practiced as a physician in Brighton in the years when the town was full of genteel residents who expected their doctors to be both scientifically competent and socially impeccable. He lived and worked on Grand Parade, an address that signaled status as clearly as a title did. Contemporary local history places him at 64 Grand Parade, where his surgery was near Edmunds' home in Gloucester Place. That proximity mattered. Obsession thrives on nearness. It feeds on the illusion that the desired person is always just across the street, always within reach. Beard's professional credentials were not a flourish. They were the backbone of his authority. Records of the Royal College of Physicians list him as Charles Izard Beard, M.B. Cantab, associated with Grand Parade in Brighton. His name appears again connected to the new government offices, Charles Street, a detail that becomes important later, because it suggests a shift from local practice to government work. In 1869, Christiana Edmunds met him and fell in love. Whether he reciprocated, flirted, encouraged, or merely failed to shut it down decisively remains contested and is colored by scandal management on all sides. What is clear is that by the summer of 1870, Beard ended the relationship. Edmunds' first direct attack on Beard's domestic life followed soon after. In September 1870, she visited Beard's wife, Emily, and presented chocolate creams that made Mrs. Beard violently ill. Beard accused Edmunds of poisoning his wife and Edmunds denied it. A Berkshire Record Office summary describes a last climactic meeting in January 1871, after which Edmunds was effectively banished from the Beard household for good. This is where Beard's story becomes inseparable from Victorian reputation. If Beard suspected Edmunds early, acting on it immediately would have forced into daylight the very thing a respectable married doctor could least afford: public acknowledgement that an unmarried woman had become emotionally entangled with him. One widely repeated account says Beard later admitted he had suspected Edmunds in connection with the poisoning of his wife but did not act due to lack of proof and fear of scandal. Even if one treats that claim cautiously, it aligns perfectly with the incentives of the era. Victorian men did not need to be immoral to be compromised. They needed only to be discussed. When the whiter poisoning campaign began, chocolates laced with strychnine sold back to the public, the moral geometry changed. The story could no longer be contained as a private mess. It became a public danger. Brighton's museum's summary notes that the police had no way of reassuring the public until Dr. Beard told them of his suspicions, after which Edmunds was arrested and charged, initially for the attempted murder of Emily Beard, and later for the death of Sidney Barker. In the narrative of the investigation, Beard is not merely a bystander. He is a hinge point. Whatever his earlier reluctance, by this stage he moved to protect his household, and crucially to prevent the story being written without him in it. After Edmunds' conviction and committal, Beard's life did what many Victorian men's lives did after scandal. It reorganized itself around distance and propriety. Local Brighton history states that he left Brighton in the early 1870s to become a medical inspector of the local government board, traveling for work, and that he later returned to Brighton in the 1880s to serve as an assistant physician at the Sussex County Hospital and physician to the Brighton and Hove Dispensary. This career arc makes sense on several levels. A government medical post offered prestige and a ready-made reason to relocate. It also removed him from the streets where the case had happened, and from the social circles where the details would be traded. The Royal College of Physicians listings strengthened this picture. A physician attached to the new government offices appears not as a rumor but as an address in formal institutional print, evidence of Beard's presence within government medical structures. The move was not a vanishing act, it was a socially acceptable exit. What is striking, though, and what matters for Christiana Edmunds' long institutional life, is the nature of Beard's absence thereafter. There is no reliable historical record that Beard ever visited Edmunds at Broadmoor. Not in the commonly cited summaries of the case, not in the institutional narratives, not in the publicly accessible accounts that draw on Broadmoor's historical context. That absence is not proof in the mathematical sense. Archives are incomplete and many records are closed, lost, or never created. But narratively and socially, it is exactly what one would expect. A visit would have been a reversal of everything the court and the asylum were trying to do. Edmunds' fixation on Beard was central to the case. Allowing the object of that fixation into the asylum would have risked reanimating the very delusional structure the verdict relied upon. From a Victorian clinical standpoint, it would have been seen as dangerous. From a Victorian social standpoint, it would have been reckless. And from Beard's standpoint, as a married physician whose wife had been poisoned, there would have been little incentive and enormous risk. It is also worth noting how asymmetrical the story becomes once Edmunds is locked away. For Christiana, Beard remained the axis of meaning, the person around whom her justifications were built. For Beard, Edmunds became a problem that the state had removed. The relationship was not ended so much as erased from daily life. That is one of the cruelest features of Victorian containment. It granted closure to the community and to the man at the center, while denying closure to the woman confined. If Beard ever felt guilt, curiosity, or lingering fear, it left little visible trace. The trajectory we can document is professional continuity. He appears to have kept working, kept his credentials, and kept moving through respectable roles in medicine, including public service. The scandal that threatened to mark him instead marked her permanently. This too is part of the true crime. Not simply that a woman poisoned chocolates in Brighton, but that the man at the center of her obsession could resume a life of professional legitimacy while she spent 36 years inside Broadmoor. His silence after her committal, his absence, his non-appearance, his refusal to re-enter the story, became a kind of invisible boundary she could never cross, even as she remained imprisoned by the narrative she had built around him. Chapter 8. Letters, Silences, and the Architecture of Obsession. If Christiana Edmunds' crimes were carried out in public, her reasoning lived on paper. Letters are the most revealing artifacts of this case, not because they offer confession in any straightforward sense, but because they expose the private machinery of Edmunds' mind more clearly than testimony ever could. In a world that discouraged women from speaking openly, correspondence became the sanctioned space for emotional articulation, and for emotional distortion. What survives of Christiana Edmunds' letters does so unevenly. Some were preserved because they were seized by police. Others survive only through quotation in trial reporting or medical summaries. Many are lost entirely. Yet even in fragmentary form, a pattern emerges with unsettling clarity. Edmunds wrote frequently. Writing was not merely a means of communication for her. It was a method of regulation. Through letters, she rehearsed grievance, justified action, and stabilized a sense of self that felt perpetually threatened by rejection. The written word allowed her to construct a narrative in which she remained central, wronged, and morally justified. The primary recipient of these letters was Charles Beard. From the beginning, Edmunds' letters to Beard blurred the line between intimacy and entitlement. They oscillated between affection and reproach, supplication and accusation. She did not write as someone seeking clarity, but as someone seeking confirmation of a conclusion she had already reached. Beard, in her telling, was not an autonomous agent making choices. He was a figure constrained by circumstance, prevented from acting on feelings she assumed were mutual. This assumption hardened over time. When Beard attempted to distance himself, whether gently or firmly, Edmunds did not interpret this as rejection. She interpreted it as concealment. Silence in her logic was not absence but evidence of pressure. Restraint was not disinterest but proof of moral conflict. The letters thus became increasingly circular, each one reinforcing the premise that the relationship existed, regardless of what Beard actually said or did. What is striking is the absence of negotiation. Edmunds' letters do not ask. They assert. They explain. They justify. She writes as though the moral structure of the situation is already settled, and her task is merely to bring Beard into alignment with it. As the poisoning campaign unfolded, the letters took on an additional function. They tethered her private actions to her private narrative. In some correspondence, she hinted at events before they were widely known. In others, she framed herself as a woman pushed to extremes by betrayal. The crimes themselves are rarely named directly. Instead, they appear obliquely as consequences, as disturbances, as forces set in motion by injustice. This indirectness mattered. It allowed Edmunds to maintain psychological distance from the harm she caused. By refusing to name the violence explicitly, she preserved the illusion that her actions were instrumental rather than lethal. For investigators, the letters were a turning point. Read in isolation, they might have been dismissed as the ramblings of an emotionally distressed woman. Read alongside the poisoning timeline, they acquired evidentiary weight. They suggested not only obsession but proximity, a mind moving in parallel with events it should not have known so much about. Once Edmunds was arrested, the letters became objects of scrutiny rather than vehicles of expression. Police and doctors read them for signs of madness, not meaning. What they found unsettled them. The letters were coherent. The handwriting was neat. The reasoning was consistent. Yet the emotional logic that underpinned them was profoundly skewed. Victorian psychiatry placed great emphasis on written expression as a window into mental state. A disordered hand or incoherent prose suggested intellectual impairment. Edmunds offered neither. Instead, she presented a more troubling case. A woman whose language functioned perfectly, even elegantly, while serving ideas that society could not accept as rational. After her committal to Broadmoor, Edmunds continued to write. Correspondence from within the asylum was tightly regulated. Letters were censored both to protect the public and to assess the patient. Edmunds complied with these restrictions, but she did not alter her fundamental tone. She wrote calmly, persistently, and with conviction. She returned again and again to themes of injustice and misunderstanding. Notably, her letters from Broadmoor do not show the emotional disintegration often associated with long confinement. She does not rage on paper. She does not collapse into incoherence. Instead, she maintains the same self-concept she had carried into the institution: rational, injured, and morally correct. And Beard remains absent. There is no evidence that Christiana Edmunds ever received a reply from him after her arrest. There is no record of a visit. No acknowledgement. The letters she wrote into the void were met with silence. Not the ambiguous silence that fuels obsession, but the absolute silence of erasure. Within Broadmoor, doctors noted that her fixation did not require reinforcement. She continued to refer to Beard as though the relationship remained morally real, even as it was practically non-existent. This persistence was taken as further evidence that her beliefs were internally generated rather than responsive to external cues. From a clinical perspective, this was damning. It suggested that even complete severance would not dismantle the structure of her reasoning. From a human perspective, it reveals something colder: that the story Edmunds told herself did not need its central character to participate. Beard's silence also served a social function. By not writing, not visiting, not engaging, he allowed the story to conclude neatly. The state confined the woman. The town moved on. The doctor resumed his career. Correspondence, once the engine of obsession, was neutralized by absence. Yet letters have a way of outliving their senders. Through them, Edmunds remains articulate, deliberate, and disturbingly consistent. They resist easy dismissal. They do not scream madness. They document a mind that built its own moral universe and defended it with grammar, logic, and restraint. In the end, the letters do not explain why Christiana Edmunds poisoned chocolates. They explain how she made it make sense to herself, and how a society more comfortable with silence than confrontation allowed that sense-making to proceed unchecked. Chapter 9. Aftermath, Memory, and the Uses of Fear. When Christiana Edmunds disappeared behind the walls of Broadmoor, Victorian England did not close the book on her case. It repurposed it. The chocolate poisonings left no single moment of catharsis. There was no execution to reassure the public, no final confession to tidy the narrative. Instead, there was confinement, indefinite, quiet, and out of sight. This outcome suited the anxieties of the age. Edmunds' removal allowed society to believe that the danger had been isolated, named, and neutralized without requiring deeper examination of how such a crime had been possible in the first place. In the months following her conviction, newspapers returned repeatedly to the case, not to interrogate its causes, but to stabilize its meaning. Reports emphasized her insanity, her emotional excess, her deviation from womanly norms. The word mad did significant cultural work. It reassured readers that the threat was not systemic. Chocolates were not dangerous. Respectable towns were not vulnerable. Women were not quietly capable of indiscriminate violence. One woman had been unwell and the state had dealt with her. This framing mattered. Poisoning as a crime unsettled Victorians in ways that overt violence did not. It was invisible, intimate, and required trust. It could be committed without strength, confrontation, or spectacle. It undermined assumptions about who could be dangerous and how danger presented itself. The Edmunds case amplified those fears precisely because it did not conform to familiar patterns of criminality. In response, institutions moved to restore boundaries. Chemists became more cautious. The sale of poisons, while still far from tightly regulated, attracted increased scrutiny. Purchasers were noted more carefully. Repeat transactions raised eyebrows where they had not before. These changes were incremental and uneven, but they reflected a shift in professional consciousness. Trust could no longer be entirely unexamined. Public attitudes toward food and gifting also hardened briefly. Chocolates, sweets, and other treats, especially when unaccounted for or anonymously given, were regarded with suspicion. That suspicion did not last. Daily life could not sustain it. But the memory lingered as a cautionary tale, invoked when fears of contamination resurfaced in later decades. For women, the implications were more enduring. Christiana Edmunds joined a small but potent group of female offenders whose crimes forced Victorian society to confront the limits of its own gender narratives. Women were supposed to be nurturers, caretakers, and moral anchors. When women committed violence, particularly calculated, repeated violence, the explanatory framework strained. Madness offered a solution. It allowed society to preserve the ideal of female virtue by isolating those who violated it as aberrations. This had consequences for other women accused of crime. Insanity defenses were applied unevenly, sometimes protecting women from execution, sometimes stripping them of legal agency entirely. Female defendants were increasingly assessed not only for what they had done, but for how closely they adhered to acceptable models of femininity. Calmness could be suspicious. Emotional intensity could be pathologized. Deviance was read through gender before it was read through law. Christiana Edmunds became a reference point in medical and legal discussions of moral insanity. Her case appeared in professional debates about whether a person could reason clearly and still be profoundly unfit for freedom. She was cited not as a patient to be understood, but as a problem to be managed. Her long confinement became evidence that some minds, once fixed, could not be trusted with autonomy. And yet, outside professional circles, her story began to thin. As years passed, the details of her life blurred. She was reduced to a label, the Brighton chocolate poisoner. Her upbringing, her education, her long decades at Broadmoor, all receded. What remained was the image of a woman who poisoned sweets, a grotesque inversion of domestic innocence. Sensation replaced complexity. This simplification served a purpose. It allowed the case to function as warning rather than inquiry. Do not trust too easily. Do not stray from your role. Do not imagine yourself wronged beyond repair. Meanwhile, Christiana herself lived on, largely forgotten. Within Broadmoor, she was not a symbol. She was a patient, a file, a routine presence. The world that debated her meaning moved forward without her participation. New crimes captured attention. New theories replaced old ones. Her confinement continued unchanged. When she died in 1907, her death did not produce renewed public debate. There were no editorials revisiting her case, no calls for reassessment. She passed quietly as she had lived for decades, contained within an institution designed to make people disappear without drama. What remains, more than a century later, is a question rather than a verdict. Was Christiana Edmunds an anomaly or a product? Was she mad in the way Victorians understood madness, or rational in a way they could not tolerate? Did her confinement protect society, or did it allow society to avoid confronting the conditions that shaped her? Her story sits at the intersection of gender, power, and silence. It reveals how easily obsession can flourish in isolation, how respectability can function as camouflage, and how institutions prefer containment to understanding when faced with contradictions they cannot resolve. Christiana Edmunds did not change the law. She did not reform psychiatry. She did not become a martyr or a monster of lasting fame. Instead, she became something more unsettling, a reminder that violence does not always announce itself with chaos, and that the line between sanity and danger is not always visible from the outside. Chapter 10. The Shape of a Life. It is tempting at the end of a case like this to return to the poison, to the chocolates, the convulsions, the fear that rippled through Brighton when a pleasure became a threat. To do so would be understandable. Crime narratives gravitate toward moments of rupture. But if Christiana Edmunds' life teaches anything, it is that rupture was not the beginning of her story. It was its consequence. What distinguishes Christiana Edmunds from many figures in the true crime canon is not the scale of her violence, but the texture of her life around it. She was not propelled by desperation, nor driven by poverty, nor intoxicated by chaos. She lived quietly. She reasoned carefully. She behaved, for the most part, exactly as she had been taught to behave. Her childhood was unremarkable. Her education was sufficient. Her social position was secure enough to protect her from scrutiny, but narrow enough to restrict her future. She learned restraint, composure, and self-containment, lessons Victorian society prized, especially in women. What she did not learn was how to relinquish desire, how to absorb rejection without reinterpreting it as injustice, or how to test emotion through reciprocal engagement rather than private rumination. In this sense, Edmunds did not fall outside her culture. She embodied its contradictions. Victorian England encouraged women to feel deeply but express little, to think carefully but act minimally, to attach themselves emotionally while remaining outwardly passive. When those imperatives collided, when feeling exceeded permission, there were few sanctioned outlets. For some women, the result was resignation. For others, it was illness. For Edmunds, it was something colder and more deliberate. Her obsession did not announce itself loudly. It took shape slowly, through interpretation rather than confrontation, through silence rather than argument. Each unanswered letter, each polite withdrawal, each social boundary reinforced a private logic that did not require correction from the outside world. By the time she acted, the act was merely the final step in a reasoning process that had been rehearsed for years. The state responded in the only way it knew how. By declaring Edmunds insane, Victorian society solved several problems at once. It removed a dangerous individual from public space. It preserved the moral fiction of female harmlessness. It avoided a public execution that would have unsettled gendered assumptions about violence. And it allowed the deeper questions raised by the case to remain largely unasked. Broadmoor became the answer rather than the inquiry. Inside its walls, Edmunds lived out the remainder of her life not in torment or chaos, but in routine. She complied. She adapted. She remained, by all accounts, composed. The institution neutralized her capacity for harm without ever dismantling the reasoning that had produced it. She was not rehabilitated, she was contained. Dr. Charles Beard returned to professional life. Brighton resumed its rhythms. Chocolates became gifts again. The public memory of the case thinned into caricature. Edmunds herself became a cautionary figure rather than a subject of sustained reflection. And yet her story resists neat resolution. She was not incoherent. He was not impulsive. She did not act in a frenzy. She acted with intention, under the guidance of a moral framework that made sense to her and to no one else. That framework did not collapse under isolation. It endured. This endurance unsettles modern readers as much as it did Victorian doctors. It complicates easy distinctions between sanity and madness, responsibility and illness. It forces us to confront the possibility that some forms of danger are not loud, erratic, or visibly broken, but calm, methodical, and socially fluent. Christiana Edmunds' life does not ask us to excuse her. It asks us to understand the conditions under which her reasoning became possible, and the systems that allowed it to proceed unchecked until it manifested as harm. In the end, her story is not only about poisoning. It is about silence. About what happens when inner lives are cultivated without correction, when respectability shields rather than reveals, and when society prefers removal to understanding. She spent 36 years behind high walls, outliving the panic she caused and the world that created her. What remains is not a monster but a mirror, one that reflects the dangers of mistaking composure for safety and restraint for moral health. Christiana Edmunds was not forgotten because her story lacked significance. She was forgotten because it was too unsettling to hold for long. That perhaps is her final legacy. Chapter 11. Brighton as Theatre and Shelter. Brighton mattered. The poisonings could not have unfolded in quite the same way in every town, because Brighton in the late 1860s and early 1870s occupied a particular place in the Victorian imagination. It was at once respectable and permissive, orderly and porous. Visitors came to recover health, to take the sea air, to spend money, to be seen, and, when useful, to disappear into a crowd that was far more fluid than the crowd of a provincial market town. A resort made its living by appearing open. Streets, lodging houses, confectioners, circulating libraries, chemists, and railway connections all depended on the easy movement of strangers. That openness carried risk. It did not abolish social scrutiny, but it thinned it. People could be known by sight and still not be known at all. They visited shops, called on acquaintances, attended church, wrote letters, took carriage rides, and circulated through the public rooms of a town like Brighton without automatically attracting scandal. Their freedom was conditional, not absolute. It rested on demeanor, dress, and the continual performance of self-command. Yet the performance itself created cover. A woman who looked composed, paid her bills, spoke politely, and kept within the expected geography of middle-class life could pass through town with very little friction. The same codes that protected her also made others slow to imagine her as a source of public danger. Brighton sharpened this paradox because it was built on display. The town encouraged looking at the sea, at promenades, at shop windows, at respectable interiors, at the daily theater of health and leisure. But display is not the same as knowledge. In places organized around surfaces, the visible can become a substitute for the true. The well-appointed shop front, the careful bonnet, the proper calling card, the neat packet of chocolates, the professional title of doctor or chemist, all acted as guarantees that were not really guarantees at all. The geography of Brighton also mattered. The resort joined domestic spaces to commercial spaces with unusual ease. One could move from lodging house to shop, from shop to post, from post to promenade, from promenade to private calling, all within a compact social world that felt both intimate and unstable. That made the circulation of poison sweets alarmingly efficient. A confectioner's counter was not an abstract market stall. It was an extension of domestic civility. Chocolates were bought for family, for children, for invalids, for flirtation, for apology, for kindness. They crossed thresholds without resistance because they belonged to the ordinary exchange of feeling. In that sense, the crime was not only chemical. It was architectural. Edmunds exploited the channels through which affection and routine already moved. What Brighton offered too was emotional weather. Resorts were places where ordinary structures loosened slightly. People came because something in their lives required relief. Illness, fatigue, disappointment, financial strain, marriage arrangements, professional pressures, boredom. Such towns gathered those forms of restlessness together and gave them elegant scenery. For someone already inclined to obsession, that mixture could be dangerous. The resort promised replenishment yet also invited fantasy. A professional man could be reimagined as more available than he was. A passing kindness could be made to carry deeper meaning. Intervals between meetings could be filled not with acceptance but with interpretation. The sea, the walks, the seasonal rhythms, and the temporary presence of outsiders all made Brighton a place where private stories could grow large without being corrected quickly enough. Victorian commentators often treated towns like Brighton as morally soft at the edges, even when they praised them as healthy and improving. That ambiguity is useful here. The resort was not disreputable in the crude sense, but it was a place where category blurred. Permanent residents and visitors, convalescence and pleasure, propriety and display, privacy and exposure. In such a setting, a person could sustain contradictory identities for longer than elsewhere. Christiana Edmunds could be at once the respectable daughter from a good background, the devoted patient or friend, the letter writer nursing grievance, the customer at the confectioner's, and the unseen origin of fear. The town did not create those selves, but it allowed them to coexist in practical terms. This helps explain why the poisonings produced so much collective unease. Brighton had sold itself as manageable modernity. Clean air, improving shops, polite society, transport links, medical care, recreation. The case demonstrated that modernity was also an expanded field of vulnerability. The more smoothly goods, letters, and people traveled, the more routes existed for malice. The more commerce depended on trust, the more devastating betrayal became when it entered the marketplace disguised as courtesy. The more women of the middle class participated in urban life under the sign of harmless respectability, the more unsettling it was when one of them used those permissions strategically. It is easy, in retrospect, to isolate Christiana Edmunds as an aberration and leave the town untouched. Yet place shaped possibility. Brighton's civility did not fail because it was uniquely weak. It failed because civility is never a defense in itself. It is a style of social arrangement, not a guarantee of moral safety. The crime emerged from that arrangement and exposed its blind spots. A town accustomed to reading surfaces had to learn, painfully, that surface could not bear the full weight of trust. The poisoned chocolates made visible what the resort economy preferred to forget, that strangers are woven into daily life long before they are understood, and that danger often travels most efficiently through the channels designed for comfort. Chapter 12. Emily Beard and the Household Under Siege. Emily Beard is frequently left at the edge of the story, named only as the doctor's wife and as the presumed target of Christiana Edmunds' earliest malice. Yet the case looks different when viewed from her position. Victorian domestic ideology placed enormous symbolic weight on the wife within the household. She was expected to stabilize the home, regulate feeling, protect children, receive visitors, and convert a husband's public standing into a moral interior. To threaten a wife, then, was not merely to threaten one person. It was to strike at the domestic order that made professional respectability legible. Emily Beard mattered not because she stood in the way of a romantic fantasy, but because she embodied the fact of marriage itself, a lawful, public, ordinary structure that fantasy could neither absorb nor abolish. The rumor and evidence surrounding the first poisoning attempts suggest a logic that was personal before it became indiscriminate. Whether every act was directed with consistent clarity is another question. Obsessive thinking seldom remains neat. But the symbolic place of Emily Beard is difficult to ignore. In the emotional arithmetic visible across Edmunds' letters and conduct, Mrs. Beard represented exclusion. She was the person who did not need to petition for access, did not have to interpret crumbs of attention, did not have to turn encounters into evidence of destiny because the structure of her life already authorized intimacy. The grievance attached to such a figure can become disproportionate precisely because the rival has done nothing melodramatic. The lawful wife does not need to persecute to be resented. Her mere existence is enough. That makes the domestic character of the crime especially important. Poison has long been associated in cultural imagination with the private sphere. food, drink, medicine, care. The Brighton case brought that association into painful focus. The object that traveled toward the household was a box of chocolates, not a weapon brandished in the street. It arrived in the register of gift, kindness, or social routine. Such objects are designed to cross the threshold without challenge. They belong to women's labor as well as women's consumption, buying for guests, for children, for illness, for small household courtesies. To contaminate that object was to invade the home through its own language. For Emily Beard, the danger would not have been confined to a single moment of alarm. Once suspicion entered the domestic sphere, daily life itself became unstable. Every edible gift could require caution. Every anonymous parcel could hold insult or injury. Every unexplained illness could invite retrospective dread. The home, celebrated so insistently by Victorians as the refuge from public disorder, became porous. This was one of the most frightening aspects of the case. The threat did not approach as a burglar or an obvious enemy. It arrived through ordinary civility. The household could bolt its doors and still remain exposed. There is also a quieter violence in the way Emily Beard was made to carry meanings that were not of her choosing. In much retelling, she is flattened into a rival, a passive emblem around whom the real drama is said to occur between Christiana Edmunds and Charles Beard. That framing reproduces a logic already present in obsessive desire. The wife is treated as a barrier rather than as a person. But barriers do not fall ill. Barriers do not manage the social consequences of scandal, the fear of further attack, the strain placed upon marriage and children, or the humiliation of public attention. A household under suspicion becomes visible in new and unwelcome ways. Servants observe, neighbors speculate, shopkeepers remember, newspapers distort. The private room is not preserved, it is exposed. One reason the case remains so disturbing is that it links sentimental object and lethal intent without dissolving either. Chocolates were not trivial luxuries in Victorian culture. They occupied a place in the economy of small affections. They could be gifts between lovers, tokens for the unwell, treats for children, refinements of hospitality. Their meaning depended on trust and on a certain softening of vigilance. Emily Beard's position brings this into focus. The attack was not only against a body. It was against the assumptions that allow domestic life to function without continuous suspicion. Once the language of care is weaponized, nothing within the household remains morally simple. Charles Beard's household also sat within a public world of professional authority. A doctor's home was not just private, it reflected medical respectability. To menace that home was to test the limits of masculine control. Victorian professional men were expected to govern both sphere and self. The consulting room through knowledge, the household through steadiness, the wider community through reputation. The poisonings made clear that neither knowledge nor reputation could prevent a determined intimate adversary from entering by subtler means. The irony is difficult to miss. A doctor associated with healing found his own domestic world infiltrated by illness delivered through the rituals of everyday civility. This does not require inventing feelings for Emily Beard that the record cannot fully preserve. The archival problem remains. Women like her often survive only in relation to the crises that interrupted them. Yet silence is not insignificance. The fact that her interior life is thinner in the record is itself part of the story. Victorian narratives, legal and journalistic alike, preferred to dwell on the abnormal woman who violated expectation rather than the ordinary woman forced to live with the consequences. Recent Ring Emily Beard does not sentimentalize the case. It restores proportion. The household was not scenery. It was a site of injury, vigilance, adaptation, and endurance. In the end, Emily Beard's place in the story reveals the emotional structure of Edmund's violence with unusual clarity. Obsession, when it cannot secure the desired bond, often turns to substitution. If the beloved cannot be possessed, the lawful claimant becomes the object through which grievance is expressed. But substitution rarely remains confined. Once that logic is established, others can be injured as collateral, symbols, or mere instruments within a private narrative that has detached itself from the reality of other lives. That movement from rival to bystander, from household to town, is essential to understanding the Brighton poisonings. The domestic attack was never merely domestic. It was the point at which a private fiction first forced itself into the public world. Chapter 13. Strychnine, Commerce, and the Fragility of Trust. The poison at the center of the Brighton case was not exotic. Strychnine belonged to the ordinary toxic landscape of 19th-century life. It was known, feared, medically discussed, commercially available under regulation, and used for practical purposes that sat uneasily beside its lethal potential. This matters because modern readers often imagine poison crimes as requiring unusual access or specialized secrecy. Victorian Britain was different. Dangerous substances circulated through a world of chemists, patent remedies, agricultural needs, vermin control, and household experiment. The boundary between medicine and poison was real, but it was not absolute. Dose, handling, record-keeping, and trust all helped maintain it. When those safeguards failed, the results could be catastrophic. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had attempted to impose greater order on precisely this problem. Poisons were to be labeled, registered, and sold with more care. But legislation does not eliminate social habit. Retail chemistry in the 19th century still relied heavily on recognition, assumption, and the routine judgments of shopkeepers. A respectable customer could be accommodated with less suspicion than an obviously disreputable one. Names were entered in poison books, yet names themselves were not infallible guarantees. Purchases could be explained by domestic need, vermin, gardening, or medical purpose. The system was designed not for a world without trust, but for a world in which trust could be supervised just enough to remain commercially workable. Strychnine also occupied an unsettling imaginative position. It was associated with suddenness, visible suffering, and unmistakable bodily crisis. Unlike poisons that worked slowly or ambiguously, strychnine announced itself with violence. Convulsions, muscular rigidity, terror of the body in extremis, these were effects likely to attract both medical attention and public horror. That very visibility made the Brighton poisonings memorable. The victims did not simply become unwell. They were overtaken by symptoms dramatic enough to fracture the assumption of accidental illness. A sweet bought at a respectable counter had produced an unmistakable catastrophe. The contrast between object and effect did much of the cultural work. Pleasure turned instantly into bodily revolt. Yet the chemical alone does not explain why the case had such reach. To understand that, one must look at the commodity into which the poison was introduced. Chocolates were unusually effective vehicles not only because they could mask bitter substances under sweetness, but because they already moved through networks of permission. They were wrapped, boxed, given, posted, shared, and consumed without ceremony. They carried enough modest luxury to feel special, but enough familiarity to avoid scrutiny. They were also deeply social. Unlike a private bottle or a prescribed draft, a box of chocolates might pass through several hands. One person bought it, another received it, a child sampled it, a guest accepted one, a shop assistant handled the remainder. The object belonged to circulation. That made contamination both practical and terrifyingly diffuse. Commerce in Victorian Britain depended on the idea that certain spaces had moral character. The confectioner's was not merely a place of sale. It represented refinement, cleanliness, moderation, and domestic suitability. The chemists, likewise, represented controlled expertise. The Brighton case forced these symbolic spaces into relation. Poison entered sweetness. The substance associated with measured caution entered the commodity associated with pleasure. This was not just a breach of safety. It was a breach of categories. Victorians worked hard to assign moral tone to places of trade. When those tones collapsed into each other, public confidence suffered. That is why the case resonated beyond the immediate victims. It touched a wider anxiety about modern retail life. Increasingly, goods were purchased from specialized shops rather than made within the household. Packaging, branding, counter display, and professional identity all invited customers to trust what they could not inspect directly. This was one of the conveniences of modern urban life. It also created new forms of dependence. The buyer trusted the maker, the retailer, the supply chain, the wrapper, the label, and the unseen processes by which substances reached the counter. Poisoning exposed the vulnerability inside that arrangement. Once suspicion enters the marketplace, every object of minor luxury becomes a potential risk. The regulation of poisons therefore sits at the center of the case, but not in the tidy sense of simple legislative failure. The records and testimony surrounding poison purchases mattered, and they helped establish the path by which Edmunds obtained strychnine. Yet the deeper issue was cultural. Regulation can record a sale, It cannot fully neutralize the assumptions people bring to the transaction. Shopkeepers still read faces, class markers, speech, and bearing. They still decide, often quickly, whether a customer belongs. Middle-class femininity carried particular force within this system because it was coded as dependent, respectable, and non-threatening. The very appearance least likely to generate alarm could therefore move most easily through the channel intended to prevent harm. One should also resist the temptation to treat poison as uniquely feminine simply because it is indirect. Victorian commentary often did exactly that, drawing crude contrasts between male violence as open and female violence as clandestine, intimate, or domestic. The Brighton case encouraged such readings because the object was edible and the method covert. But the more revealing point is not that poison naturally belongs to women. It is that 19th-century social arrangements made certain routes of action more available than others. A woman excluded from many overt forms of power could still buy, send, wrap, wait, and exploit the permissions attached to care and commerce. Poison became legible within those permissions because it moved through ordinary acts already associated with femininity and household management. The chemical history of the case therefore cannot be separated from its social history. Strychnine was lethal, but it was the structure of trust that made it an effective weapon. The confectioner, the chemist, the parcel, the domestic gift, the respectable errand, the unremarkable customer, all these were components of the crime. Modernity did not merely supply new goods. It supplied new interfaces between strangers. Those interfaces are efficient because they presume good faith most of the time. The Brighton poisonings entered that presumption and used it against itself. What the case revealed, in the clearest terms, was that trust is not an opposite of danger. Trust is the condition through which much danger travels. Victorian Britain could regulate poisons more tightly, refine retail practice, and punish offenders, but it could not abolish the fact that daily life requires faith in people and systems only partly known. The horror of the chocolates lay in their perfect fit with ordinary expectation. They were plausible gifts, plausible purchases, plausible pleasures. The poison was shocking because it did not arrive as something alien. It arrived in the form of something already welcomed. Chapter 14. Detection and the slow making of proof. By the time the Brighton poisonings acquired a clear criminal shape, suspicion had already traveled faster than proof. That imbalance is typical of public crises. People sense pattern before institutions can demonstrate it. Illness clusters, rumors spread, a shop is mentioned, a customer remembered, a letter reconsidered, and from these fragments a shared intuition begins to form. But law cannot proceed on intuition alone. One of the most revealing features of the case is how laborious certainty was. The resolution did not arrive through a single brilliant deduction. It was assembled slowly from ordinary acts of noticing. Shopkeepers were central to that process. Retailers occupied a peculiar position in 19th-century urban life. They knew many people a little. They remembered regular customers, manners, preferences, unusual requests, and the texture of transactions that did not quite fit. Such knowledge was rarely formal, yet it could become decisive when retrospect gave it meaning. A poison purchase entered into a book, a repeat visit to a confectioner's, a nervous exchange, the recollection of packaging, the timing of a complaint. These did not look like certainty in isolation. Together they narrowed the field. The marketplace, which had enabled the crime through routine trust, also stored the traces from which investigators could begin to reconstruct it. This is one reason why middle-class anonymity is always partial. Christiana Edmunds could move through Brighton under the shelter of respectability, but she could not move without leaving impressions. The very commercial civility that made shop assistants reluctant to suspect her also made them attentive to habit. Respectable trade depended on memory. Who ordered what, who paid promptly, who asked questions, who returned goods, who seemed known to a local doctor or family. Once the poisoning cases became linked, those memories were reactivated and rearranged. Retail life turned into evidentiary life. Police work in such a case required patience rather than theatrical force. The object was not merely to discover that poison existed, but to connect poison to persons, acts, and intent. This involved witness statements, material remnants, purchase records, correspondence, and expert opinion. Each category carried uncertainty. Witnesses misremember. Records can be incomplete. Letters may suggest feeling without explicitly admitting action. Scientific evidence can establish the presence of a substance without narrating the full chain by which it entered the suite. The challenge was cumulative. Investigators had to produce a pattern strong enough to withstand the defense that coincidence, mistake, or misinterpretation had infected the inquiry. Medical testimony played a significant role here, but it too had limits. 19th-century toxicology was increasingly professionalized, and chemical analysis could identify strychnine with a confidence that mattered in court. Yet chemistry does not speak by itself. Results must be handled, explained, and situated within human events. The poisoned chocolate must be linked to the victim to the symptoms to the analyst's findings, and the findings to a person with opportunity and motive. This chain is where the social world re-enters the scientific one. Analysts may isolate the poison, but the case against a suspect still depends on the mundane infrastructure of everyday life: shops, parcels, handwriting, recognition, timing. The letters associated with Christiana Edmunds complicated matters in both useful and dangerous ways. They helped reveal the emotional structure surrounding the case, especially in relation to Charles and Emily Beard, but they also invited interpretive overreach. Obsession visible on paper is not, in itself, a confession to every later act. Investigators and journalists alike were tempted to read backward from known crimes into all previous correspondence, turning ambiguity into inevitability. Such reading can produce a satisfying narrative, yet it risks smoothing the disorder by which real cases unfold. The evidentiary strength of the letters lay not in melodrama, but in convergence. They aligned with purchases, appearances, and patterns of behavior that together made alternative explanations increasingly difficult to sustain. Public fear undoubtedly pressured the machinery of detection. A case involving poisoned sweets and injured children could not remain administratively calm. Newspapers amplified anxiety, repeated details selectively, and invited readers to imagine further unseen threats. This publicity was double-edged. It helped create vigilance and encouraged witnesses or traitors to come forward, but it also contaminated the atmosphere in which evidence was interpreted. Once a town becomes convinced that a hidden poisoner moves among it, every recollection acquires new gravity. Investigators had to work within that charged field without surrendering entirely to it. What ultimately emerges from the surviving record is not the triumph of pure science or pure intuition, but the cooperation of many imperfect observers. The shopkeeper who remembered a face, the clerk who noted a name, the analyst who confirmed the substance, the doctor who read the symptoms, the police officer who aligned statements, the court that weighed cumulative force, all contributed to the making of proof. This collective labor is easy to overlook because crime narratives often prefer singular heroes. The Brighton case resists that simplification. Its solution, insofar as such cases are ever cleanly solved, depended on the slow conversion of dispersed social knowledge into admissible fact. There is an irony here that deepens the case rather than resolves it. The same society that enabled Edmunds to pass under the sign of harmless respectability also produced the web of observation that caught her. Victorian life was dense with informal surveillance. Neighbors, servants, traders, clerks, patients, relatives, and correspondents all registered fragments of one another. Much of the time this network functioned as social discipline. In moments of crisis it became investigative infrastructure. Proof was not made outside ordinary life. It was extracted from it. This has consequences for how the case should be read. The poisonings were not solved because some hidden criminal essence suddenly revealed itself. They were solved because routine transactions once reinterpreted yielded pattern. That pattern was persuasive enough to support conviction, even as arguments about mental state complicated the moral meaning of guilt. Detection therefore did not end uncertainty. It shifted its location. After proof of action came debate about explanation. Had a calculating criminal been identified, a disordered mind, or both at once? The answer mattered profoundly for sentence and memory. But before that debate could begin, the slower and less glamorous labor had to be done. Someone had to show, piece by piece, that poisoned chocolates were not accidents of trade or fate. They were acts. And acts, however disguised, leave trails. Chapter 15. Female criminality, insanity, and the limits of explanation. From the start, Christiana Edmunds posed a classificatory problem for Victorian culture. She had done something plainly terrible. People had suffered. A child had nearly died. A town had been frightened. Yet the person at the center of the case did not fit the common image of the violent offender. She was not poor in the manner respectable commentary most feared. She was not publicly drunken, sexually notorious, or visibly rough. She was educated, middle class, and female. These facts did not lessen the gravity of the crime, but they altered the vocabulary through which society tried to explain it. Victorian Britain possessed established narratives for criminal women, though they were often contradictory. One script cast them as fallen and degraded, victims of moral collapse who moved through prostitution, drunkenness, neglect, and petty vice. Another cast them as monsters of concealment, unnatural women who perverted the maternal or domestic sphere through infanticide, poisoning, manipulation, or sexual deceit. A respectable unmarried woman who poisoned through boxes of chocolates touched the second script, but not comfortably. Edmunds was neither entirely legible as a social outcast nor comfortably confined to the category of demonic deviance. Too much in her bearing still resembled the social order that wished to expel her. Insanity offered a solution to this discomfort, though not an innocent one. To declare a defendant mad is sometimes presented as a compassionate recognition of diminished responsibility. In practice, it can also function as a cultural repair mechanism. The label tells society that the frightening act does not, after all, belong within ordinary moral life. It can be removed from the category of the explainable and placed inside medicalized exception. In Edmunds' case, the move toward insanity did not erase the fact of guilt. On the contrary, the legal proceedings made clear that the acts themselves were taken seriously. What insanity altered was the frame within which those acts would be punished, remembered, and contained. The sequence matters. Edmunds was not simply waved away from the dock into asylum care. She was convicted and initially sentenced to death, and only then reprieved on grounds tied to mental unsoundness. That progression reveals much about Victorian procedure and about Victorian ambivalence. The law asserted its authority through conviction and sentence. The state then retreated from execution when medical and moral discomfort with her mental condition proved too strong to ignore. In effect, society spoke in two voices at once. One voice said, "This was criminal, deliberate, and intolerable." The other said, "This woman cannot be assimilated to the ordinary category of the punishable offender." Broadmoor became the institution through which those voices could coexist. Medical testimony in such cases was never purely clinical. Alienists and doctors did not merely identify disease. They interpreted conduct through the assumptions of their time. Obsessive fixation, emotional excess, erotic delusion, religious distortion, hereditary weakness, and menstrual or reproductive theories could all enter the discussion around women's minds. Some of these frameworks now appear crude or openly misogynistic. Yet they had genuine institutional power. They helped courts and officials decide who could be hanged, who must be confined, and which forms of dangerousness were deemed curable, chronic, or morally opaque. A woman's refusal to conform emotionally could be read as symptom. Her manipulation could be read as evidence of cold rationality. Often the two readings competed rather than canceling each other. Class sharpened these contradictions. Middle-class defendants more readily attracted elaborate psychological interpretation because their crimes violated stronger assumptions about self-command. A laboring woman accused of violence might be dismissed as coarse, brutal, or degraded. A lady or someone near enough to that status invited diagnosis. This is not because class privilege protected women from condemnation altogether. Edmunds was removed from society for life. But the meaning of her condemnation changed under the pressure of class expectations. The respectable criminal had to be explained, and insanity was one of the most powerful explanatory tools available. It is important, however, not to swing to the opposite error and treat insanity as mere patriarchal fiction imposed upon an otherwise lucid strategist. The surviving evidence suggests a far messier reality. Edmunds could plan, wait, purchase, write, adapt, and dissemble. She could also sustain emotional convictions drastically out of proportion to shared reality. These are not mutually exclusive states. A disordered mind is not necessarily an incoherent one. Much of the difficulty of the case lies precisely here. She appears neither as a simple calculating poisoner nor as a person wholly detached from consequence in every moment. Victorian institutions, like modern readers, sought cleaner categories than the evidence easily permits. The gendered stakes of the case were therefore broad. Public commentary could use Edmunds to warn about female secrecy, sentimental excess, frustrated desire, or the dangers of overeducated unmarried women. Medical commentary could use her to illustrate delusion, monomania, or moral insanity. Legal commentary could use her to test the relation between culpability and mental incapacity. In every version, the singular case became a site onto which wider anxieties about women were projected. The crime mattered, but so did the symbolic labor it was forced to perform. This helps explain why female poisoners occupy such a persistent place in cultural memory. Poison seems to align too well with the older fantasies attached to women: invisibility, interiority, patience, access to food and care, resentment hidden beneath decorum. Yet those fantasies are themselves social constructions. They arise from a world that confined many women to indirect forms of influence and then expressed horror when indirect methods were used destructively. The point is not to excuse such violence by reference to constraint. It is to see that methods become meaningful within the structures that make them thinkable. Edmunds' case remains useful and troubling because it resists the peace offered by any single explanation. Gender alone does not solve it. Nor does class, desire, law, or medicine. Each illuminates something and obscures something else. Insanity is part of the story, but it should not be permitted to tidy the story beyond recognition. The category protected the state from the spectacle of executing a woman whose mind appeared profoundly disordered. It also placed her into an institution where the messy coexistence of responsibility and pathology could be managed without being fully resolved. Broadmoor was, in that sense, not merely a hospital or a prison substitute. It was a container for explanatory failure. One should be wary of retrospective confidence here. To declare with perfect certainty what Christiana Edmunds really was, is to repeat the simplifying impulse of the very culture that first tried to fix her meaning. Better to acknowledge the difficulty. She acted. Her actions caused grave harm. She also appears to have lived within a distorted emotional and mental world that neither abolished intention nor sat comfortably beside full moral normality. The Victorian response, conviction, death sentence, reprieve, lifelong confinement, was contradictory because the case itself was contradictory. That contradiction is not a flaw in the record. It is one of its most revealing truths. Chapter 16. Broadmoor, Time and the Unfinished Afterlife. Once Christiana Edmunds entered Broadmoor, the public drama altered in form but did not entirely end. The most visible phase of the case, the illness, the investigation, the trial, the headlines, gave way to a different kind of narrative, one defined by duration. Broadmoor was built to hold those whose danger and mental condition made ordinary punishment unsatisfactory to the state. Its order depended on routine: records, wards, observations, privileges, restrictions, diagnoses, incidents, decline. Such institutions transform event into time. The crime that once erupted across a town is reprocessed into decades of management. That management should not be romanticized. Confinement at Broadmoor was not a neutral medical pause. It was a total social fact. The inmate lost ordinary civic identity and became an object of administrative reading. Symptoms, conduct, progress, relapse, discipline, correspondence, bodily condition. For a woman like Edmunds, whose offenses had so much to do with distorted attachment and the misuse of respectable permissions, institutional life replaced the flexible space of town and household with a regime of fixed boundaries. Choice narrowed. Observation intensified. Every petition or expression could be interpreted through prior dangerousness. The walls did not merely restrain movement. They redefined personhood. Long confinement also changes how a life is remembered. The public usually thinks in terms of dramatic acts. Institutions think in terms of maintenance. Decades at Broadmoor can flatten into a line in the historical record: detained until death. Yet those years mattered. They represented the state's ongoing conclusion that Edmunds remained unsafe or unreleasable. Whatever fluctuations occurred within her mental state, the system did not discover in them a basis for restoration to ordinary society. The sentence she escaped by reprieve was finite in one brutal sense. The asylum confinement that replaced it became, effectively, for life. Time inside such institutions has its own cruelty. It does not need spectacle. Repetition, classification, and slow bodily aging can drain a case of the dramatic features that once made it newsworthy while preserving its punitive substance. A woman who had once terrified Brighton became, over the years, an administrative fact within Broadmoor. This is one reason her case later invited myth. When the visible story ends but the person continues in seclusion, imagination rushes to fill the gap. True crime retellings compress the long institutional middle because it offers less immediate sensation. Yet that middle is essential. It is where the Victorian state decided what to do with a dangerous woman it would neither hang nor trust. Broadmoor itself occupied an uneasy place in public thought. It was a site of fear, curiosity, and reassurance. People needed to believe that those confined there were being held securely and interpreted expertly. The institution promised that certain forms of harm could be segregated from ordinary life without surrendering entirely to vengeance. In practice, of course, asylum medicine was limited, shaped by its era, and often interwoven with discipline rather than cure. Still, the existence of Broadmoor allowed society to convert an unsatisfactory case into a manageable outcome. The poisoner had vanished behind walls. Public order could resume. But public order resumed unevenly. The Brighton poisonings remained a story because they touched so many durable anxieties. The danger in ordinary commodities, the instability of respectable appearances, the fear of female malice masked by refinement, the permeability of the domestic sphere, and the uneasy overlap between criminal intent and mental disturbance. Each generation has found its own use for these anxieties. Some retellings emphasize obsession and read the case as a dark romance gone rancid. Others emphasize madness and treat Edmunds as pitiable rather than terrifying. Others still emphasize the poison sweet as a Gothic image, innocence betrayed by confectionery. Each version captures part of the case and reduces the rest. What tends to disappear in these retellings is scale. Christiana Edmunds did not become memorable merely because she poisoned. She became memorable because she poisoned through the ordinary mechanisms of trust, because her victims included strangers and children, because she sat within the respectable middle class, and because the law itself hesitated over how to classify her. Broadmoor prolonged that difficulty rather than resolving it. The institution kept her body contained, but it could not produce a final interpretation that later readers would unanimously accept. Was she a cold strategist exploiting insanity, or a profoundly disturbed woman capable of planning within delusion? The record keeps both questions alive. Her death in 1907 did not settle the matter. Death often closes the administrative file but not the cultural one. After a sensational case, memory continues to sort and resort the person according to whatever the present finds useful. In one era she becomes a warning against lax poison control. In another she becomes an example of erotic fixation. In another she is absorbed into the broader gallery of Victorian female criminals, placed beside women whose lives differed sharply from her own but whose stories satisfy a shared appetite for the abnormal. What is lost in such grouping is the specific texture of Edmunds' case. Its mix of social polish, private distortion, public fear, and institutional afterlife. There is, moreover, an ethical problem in the way confinement can erase victims while preserving notoriety. Once the offender disappears into Broadmoor, the victim's continuing lives and injuries often recede from narrative view. The town heals unevenly, households recover or do not. Memory persists in families more quietly than in newspapers. Meanwhile, the confined offender acquires the strange glamour that attaches to any name sealed within infamous walls. A responsible history has to resist that asymmetry. Broadmoor is part of the story, but it must not become a stage set that recenters fascination at the expense of harm. At the same time, refusal of glamour should not collapse into simplification. Institutional life is historically important because it shows how societies manage those they cannot comfortably understand. Edmunds was not simply removed. She was interpreted for decades through records, diagnoses, and bureaucratic judgment. That process reveals as much about Victorian governance as the original crime reveals about Victorian fear. Broadmoor turned the unresolved question of what to do with such a woman into an enduring practice of custody. In that sense, the institution was not the epilogue to the case. It was one of the case's main meanings. To follow Christiana Edmunds from Brighton to Broadmoor is therefore to watch a society move from panic to administration. The movement seems calm on the surface, yet it rests on unresolved tension. Panic asks who did this and how to stop it. Administration asks how to hold a person whose danger is entangled with a mind judged unsound. Both questions are serious. Neither yields a wholly satisfying answer. That may be why the story endures. It closes procedurally but not imaginatively. What remains after the headlines and after the years of confinement is not a tidy moral. It is a pattern of pressures: desire without reciprocity, class respectability as cover, consumer trust as vulnerability, law strained by mental disorder, and institution as the state's answer to what it could not cleanly explain. Broadmoor kept Christiana Edmunds from the public world. It did not finish the interpretation of her life. That unfinishedness is part of her afterlife and part of why her story still unsettles. Some cases are remembered because they produce clarity. This one is remembered because it never quite does. Chapter 17. The Press and the Manufacture of the Female Monster. The newspapers did not invent the Brighton poisonings, but they shaped the form in which the public understood them. Victorian journalism sat at the intersection of information, moral instruction, and entertainment. Court reporting, police intelligence, social commentary, and sensation writing bled into one another more often than later readers sometimes assume. A case like Christiana Edmunds offered especially fertile material. It combined domestic intrusion, commercial betrayal, class respectability, medical evidence, and a woman who could be presented as both composed and terrifying. The press seized on these tensions because they sold papers, but also because they helped organize social fear into narrative. Female defendants were rarely described in neutral terms. A woman accused of serious violence was made legible through appearance, demeanor, dress, speech, and any sign that might reconcile her sex with her conduct. If she looked wild, the report could present savagery made visible. If she looked calm, the report could present calmness as proof of unnatural coldness. The respectable woman therefore occupied a peculiarly inescapable position. Her composure did not protect her from sensationalism, it intensified it. Christiana Edmunds was especially susceptible to this treatment. The gap between the expected harmlessness of a middle-class woman and the horror of poisoned chocolates created the exact contrast sensational journalism preferred. The press also condensed a long, messy process into morally efficient scenes. Complex chains of evidence became emblematic moments. A poisoned sweet, a convulsing child, a doctor's wife under threat, a box on a shop counter, a woman in court, a sentence pronounced. Each detail could be lifted from context and made to carry more narrative weight than the full archive strictly permits. This is not merely a matter of inaccuracy. It is a matter of genre. Newspapers needed a case to mean something quickly. They therefore selected symbols capable of doing large explanatory work. In Edmunds' case, chocolate and femininity became the two most potent symbols of all. What those symbols produced was the figure of the female monster who remains socially legible. She is not a brute from outside civilization, but a woman formed within it who uses its refinements as cover. Such figures are especially compelling because they invite readers to suspect ordinary life. The lady caller, the sympathetic friend, the well-spoken patient, the purchaser of domestic goods. Any of these roles might conceal malice. Journalism thrives on such reversals. They convert structural anxieties into memorable persons. The danger, of course, is that the person then becomes a screen onto which collective fear is projected until much of the real complexity disappears. Insanity complicated journalistic treatment without reducing its sensational appeal. Indeed, madness could intensify fascination rather than dampen it. A woman judged insane was still dangerous, perhaps more so because her motives were imagined as less stable, less predictable, and less open to ordinary social management. The newspaper could therefore oscillate between moral condemnation and clinical curiosity, sometimes within the same report. Edmunds could be represented as wicked, pitiable, cunning, deranged, erotic, vindictive, or all of these in unstable combination. This instability mirrored the wider Victorian difficulty of classifying her, but the press converted difficulty into drama. There was also a commercial logic to emphasizing the exceptional nature of the case. Newspapers operate by distinguishing the newsworthy from the routine. A quiet poisoning case resolved through technical evidence would not command prolonged attention. A middle-class woman terrorizing Brighton through confectionery could. The more the case seemed to violate expected boundaries, womanhood, domesticity, leisure, consumption, medical respectability, the more valuable it became as copy. Sensation was not an accidental byproduct. It was integral to the business of print. Yet journalists were not simply distorting spectators. They also participated in social regulation. Reports on the case taught readers how to feel about trust, purchase, female conduct, and the authority of courts and doctors. They warned, reassured, and distributed blame. Public alarm about poisoned goods could be balanced by the promise that institutions had acted. Horror at the offender could be balanced by relief that she was confined. In this sense, the press helped convert a threatening event into a moral lesson, even while intensifying its emotional charge. The afterlife of the case owes much to these early print habits. Later retellings often inherit the emphases first set by journalists. The chocolate poisoner label, the fixation on forbidden desire, the fascination with courtroom demeanor, the collapsing of years of confinement into a single Gothic image. Once a case has been narratively branded, it is difficult to recover the quieter textures that do not suit the brand. Christiana Edmunds has survived in cultural memory partly because the press found very early the form in which she could be endlessly recirculated. This does not mean historians should dismiss newspaper material. On the contrary, the press is indispensable, especially in cases where personal papers are scattered or lost. But newspapers must be read with an ear for performance. They are records of events and records of appetite at the same time. They show not only what happened, but what kinds of female criminality Victorians most wanted to imagine. In Edmunds' case, those desires were clear. A woman refined enough to frighten, irrational enough to fascinate, and singular enough to be turned into a warning. The press did not merely report the female monster. It helped manufacture the terms on which she could be remembered. Chapter 18. Respectability, spinsterhood, and the problem of unused lives. No account of Christiana Edmunds can avoid the social position from which she acted. The unmarried middle-class woman with education, leisure, and limited legitimate outlet for emotional or vocational ambition. Victorian culture did not invent such women, but it struggled to accommodate them openly. The language of the surplus woman circulated through the century as demographic imbalance, imperial policy, marriage markets, and middle-class anxiety combined to produce a familiar question. What was to be done with women who did not marry but were reared as though marriage were their natural destination? The question was often asked administratively or morally. For women living inside it, the consequences were intimate. Spinsterhood in itself was not deviant. Many unmarried women lived useful, dignified, and intellectually active lives within families, schools, churches, philanthropic networks, or modest economies of self-support. But respectability came at a cost. The same class that valued refinement often restricted the forms in which that refinement could become action. A woman could be cultivated, musical, literate, observant, even strong-minded, yet find that her serious emotional and intellectual energies had nowhere fully authorized to go. She might become indispensable in small domestic ways while remaining structurally peripheral in larger ones. Such conditions did not produce violence by any mechanical law. They did, however, produce pressure. The danger of reading Christiana Edmunds through this lens is obvious. One does not want to turn frustrated unmarried womanhood into a causal shortcut, as though countless ordinary spinsters stood one disappointment away from poisoning. That would be both false and cruel. The point is subtler. Social forms shape the routes by which people imagine fulfillment, grievance, entitlement, and injury. In a world that trained women to prize emotional exclusivity, moral significance, and private influence, but offered them few recognized means of enlarging a life that had narrowed, an attachment could swell beyond proportion. The beloved person becomes not just desired but structurally necessary to the self-story. Class intensified this pattern. A poor unmarried woman might be forced into labor that left little room for obsessive elaboration, though hardship brought its own brutalities. A woman on private means could possess time, literacy, privacy, and the social cover needed to sustain fantasy more extensively. Leisure is not always freedom. Under certain conditions, it becomes the medium in which grievance matures. Days unbroken by urgent external claims can fill with interpretation, rehearsal, memory, and the rewriting of other people's actions into personal destiny. The letters associated with Edmunds suggest such a process, the conversion of limited contact into an entire moral universe. Victorian moralists often feared idleness in women for precisely this reason, though they named the danger in ways that now sound condescending or absurd. They warned against overheated imagination, novel reading, emotional indulgence, nervous self-absorption, and the absence of practical duty. Much of this commentary was patriarchal and disciplinary. Yet beneath it lay a dim recognition that lives structured around waiting can become psychologically unstable. Waiting for marriage, for invitation, for acknowledgement, for a future that never quite begins, these are not neutral experiences. They shape the tempo of thought. Respectability further complicated matters because it discourages open admission of rage. Middle-class women were trained to refine feeling, not to discharge it publicly. Anger had to be recoded as injury, illness, moral disappointment, wounded devotion, or righteous principle. When such recoding becomes habitual, destructive emotion does not vanish. It changes costume. A woman may continue to appear composed while nursing increasingly absolute grievances. Social polish can therefore make inner distortion harder to read until it has already hardened into conviction. This is one reason the case unsettled contemporaries so deeply. Christiana Edmunds could not be dismissed as a woman outside the social order. She was one of its products. She had acquired its manners, its reading, its emotional grammar, and its dependence on appearances. The question therefore became uncomfortable. What if respectable culture did not merely fail to detect certain dangers, but helped form the conditions in which they could grow? Victorian society preferred to answer by isolating her as mad. That answer contained truth, but it also limited the inquiry. The figure of the spinster has often been handled unkindly in both history and fiction, turned into a repository for frustration, eccentricity, thwarted desire, or parasitic bitterness. Such caricatures do real damage, not least because they obscure the sheer variety of unmarried women's lives. Yet the caricature persists because it condenses genuine social tensions. The unmarried woman can seem too free to those who prize domestic subordination, and too constrained to those who recognize how little recognized authority she holds. She hovers awkwardly between dependency and autonomy. Edmund's life occupied that awkwardness to an extreme and destructive degree. Seen in this light, the case exposes a broader Victorian problem: the wastefulness with which women's capacities could be handled. Education without vocation, feeling without recognized outlet, independence without public purpose, dependence without marital settlement. These are not recipes for crime, but neither are they trivial. They mark a society that cultivated inwardness more readily than scope. Some women turned that inwardness toward art, philanthropy, scholarship, caregiving, or quiet resilience. Edmunds turned it toward obsession and harm. The difference is crucial. So is the common structure from which the divergence became thinkable. To recognize this is not to pathologize spinsterhood, still less to excuse violence as the natural complaint of disappointed women. It is to restore social density to a case too often reduced to lurid singularity. Christiana Edmunds was unusual. The world that made her intelligible was not. Respectability, unmarried womanhood, emotional discipline, and unused capacities formed part of the atmosphere she breathed. When that atmosphere combined with particular fixations and a mind capable of distortion, the result was catastrophic. The lesson is not that the spinster is dangerous. It is that lives forced into narrow symbolic roles can become stranger, sadder, and more volatile than the culture around them is willing to admit. Chapter 19. Children, Innocence, and the Public Imagination. The Brighton poisonings would have been alarming under any circumstances, but the involvement of children gave the case a particular emotional power. Victorian culture invested heavily in the child as a symbol of innocence, dependence, and moral claim. The century's sentimental literature, philanthropic reforms, schooling debates, and domestic ideals all helped consolidate the figure of the child as someone to be protected, improved, and cherished, even if real children, especially poor children, were often denied such protection in practice. When poisoned chocolates reached children, the crime crossed a boundary that public culture had drawn in especially bright lines. This symbolic weight helps explain why the case spread so rapidly beyond the immediate circle of intended grievance. An adult woman menacing a doctor's household was shocking. A woman distributing poisoned sweets that could be eaten by any unsuspecting child was something else again. It suggested not merely revenge, but indifference to the most sacred limits of ordinary sympathy. The image required very little elaboration. A sweet, a child, sudden convulsions. The sequence could be understood across class lines and reproduced instantly in newspaper columns and household conversation. Confectionery intensified this effect because sweets already occupied a meaningful place in the cultural organization of childhood. They were treats, rewards, tokens of affection, small instruments of celebration or comfort. Adults gave them to children under the sign of care. Shop windows displayed them in ways that invited delight. To transform such an object into a vehicle of poison was to attack not only the body of a child but the moral texture of a relationship. The adult who offers a sweet promises pleasure and safety in miniature. The poisoned chocolate turned that promise inside out. There is an important distinction, however, between cultural symbolism and actual intent. Not every poisoned chocolate in the Brighton case was necessarily selected with a child specifically in mind. Indiscriminate methods do not always begin with indiscriminate desires. Yet once a method enters public circulation, intention ceases to confine consequence. This is part of what made the case so damning. Even if some acts were rooted in a private obsession, the chosen means accepted or refused to care about a broader field of vulnerability. Children became the clearest proof of that moral expansion. The public response to injured or threatened children also performed ideological work. Victimized childhood allowed the case to be narrated as an attack on the future, on innocence, on the home, and on the implicit trust between adult and child. Such framing was powerful, but it could also simplify the wider array of victims. Adults who fell ill mattered too, as did the household subjected to repeated menace, the shopkeepers whose trade came under suspicion, and the town unsettled by fear. Nonetheless, the child victim became the emotional center because Victorian society needed such centers. They convert diffuse anxiety into a single unquestionable claim to sympathy. This emphasis had consequences for the offender's image. A woman accused of harming children through sweets was almost impossible to reconcile with dominant ideals of femininity. Even women who were not mothers were presumed to stand in some relation to nurturing, tenderness, or at least instinctive care for the young. Edmunds' case violated that assumption dramatically. The result was a form of horror that exceeded ordinary condemnation. The public did not simply judge her actions criminal. It experienced them as anti-feminine, anti-domestic, and anti-human in a concentrated way. The child sharpened all those judgments. At the same time, historians should resist using child victims only as symbols. Real children suffer concretely, not allegorically. The medical violence of strychnine in a small body would have been terrifying. So too would the fear experienced by families who could no longer take small pleasures for granted. To retain the human scale of the case means holding on to those immediate realities rather than allowing them to dissolve into abstract innocence. Victorian newspapers often invited readers to imagine a sentimental child in the abstract. A more careful history notices bodies, households, recoveries, and lingering dread. The place of children in the case also exposes a broader contradiction in 19th-century modern life. The era expanded markets for goods aimed at domestic comfort and juvenile delight, while relying on systems of manufacture, retail, and regulation that were never fully transparent to consumers. Childhood treats were part of commercial modernity. Their safety depended on invisible chains of trust. When those chains were breached, parents confronted the unsettling fact that care itself had become mediated by strangers, confectioners, suppliers, shop assistants, carriers. The poisoned chocolate is therefore not only a Gothic image. It is a modern one. Remembering the child victims of the Brighton poisonings does more than intensify the case. It clarifies what was at stake when ordinary commodities became suspect. The offense was not just against individuals, though it was that. It was against a moral economy in which adults are meant to be able to place small sweetness into a child's hand without fear. Once that confidence is shaken, society experiences more than alarm. It experiences injury to one of its most intimate scripts of care. That is why the case endured, and why the image of the poisoned sweet has never wholly lost its force. Chapter 20. Sources, Silences, and the Ethics of Retelling. Cases like Christiana Edmunds invite certainty they do not entirely deserve. The outlines are clear enough. Poisoned chocolates, panic in Brighton, evidence linking Edmunds to the crimes, conviction, death sentence, reprieve, and decades at Broadmoor. Yet once the narrative moves beyond those anchor points, the record becomes uneven. Some voices survive through court proceedings, newspaper reports, medical notes, and official correspondence. Others are thinned to shadows. Motive can be inferred from letters and conduct, but not always demonstrated in the simple language later readers prefer. Historical writing on such a case must therefore do more than repeat dramatic facts. It must decide how to handle absence. The first difficulty is generic. Court records preserve conflict because conflict is what law processes. Newspapers preserve the arresting because the arresting is what print monetizes and disseminates. Medical files preserve behavior in relation to diagnosis and institutional management. None of these forms is neutral, and none was designed to preserve a full human life. They catch people at points of strain. This means that Christiana Edmunds reaches us already filtered through institutions motivated by punishment, explanation, or publicity. That does not invalidate the sources. It does require care in how confidently they are read. The second difficulty is asymmetry. Some figures in the case appear in abundance relative to others. The defendant attracts intense descriptive interest. Charles Beard appears because his professional role and relationship to Edmunds are narratively useful. Emily Beard and the victims, by contrast, often emerge in thinner and more instrumental ways. The imbalance is partly archival and partly cultural. Institutions recorded the extraordinary woman more avidly than the ordinary people endangered by her. Historians inherit that distortion. To write responsibly is not to pretend it can be entirely cured, but to refuse letting the distortion dictate moral emphasis. Silence presents a special temptation in true crime because absence invites invention. Where a childhood appears unremarkable, writers may try to insert hidden trauma. Where a motive looks disproportionate, they may force a neat causal origin. Where institutional records say little about feeling, they may substitute atmosphere or melodrama. Such strategies can make a story seem complete, but completeness purchased by invention is a poor bargain. The case of Christiana Edmunds is unsettling partly because it denies those satisfactions. It offers obsession without full confession, illness without simple diagnostic closure, and punishment without a final moral answer. To preserve that difficulty is not a failure of storytelling. It is fidelity to the historical problem. This does not mean historical prose must be dry or evasive. Narrative remains necessary. Readers need sequence, emphasis, and interpretation. The challenge is to distinguish between informed inference and decorative certainty. One may say, for example, that the surviving evidence strongly suggests an obsessive attachment to Charles Beard and a hostile fixation on his household. One may say that Brighton's commercial and social structures enabled the circulation of poison sweets in particular ways. One may say that Victorian gender assumptions shaped both the trial and the memory of the case. These are interpretive claims, but they are grounded. What one should avoid is pretending to hear thoughts the record does not preserve or smoothing contradiction merely because contradiction is aesthetically inconvenient. The ethics of retelling also involve tone. Female offenders in particular have long been made to serve as entertainment under the cover of moral seriousness. Their clothing, face, desirability, emotional instability, or deviation from femininity is dwelt upon with an attention that often exceeds concern for victims. The result is a kind of cultural double movement: condemnation on the surface, fascination beneath it. A restrained narrative voice is not a matter of stylistic preference alone. It is a way of resisting the invitation to turn a destructive life into a glamorous spectacle. At the same time, restraint should not become false neutrality. There is a risk in adopting such an impersonal tone that harm itself is flattened. The poison chocolates caused real suffering. A careful historian must preserve proportion without draining force. This means keeping the victims visible, keeping the moral seriousness of the acts intact, and refusing the softening effect that sometimes creeps into stories of mad women whose violence is recoded as tragic atmosphere rather than concrete injury. Ethical retelling requires a difficult balance. No sensationalism, no sentimental absolution. Another issue is presentism. Modern readers bring familiar categories to old cases: stalking, erotomania, coercive fixation, forensic pathology, media frenzy, and those categories can illuminate features Victorians named differently or not at all. But they can also obscure the terms through which 19th century people understood themselves. The historian must move in both directions at once, close enough to the period to preserve its structures of feeling, distant enough to recognize their limitations and biases. In Edmunds' case, that means taking Victorian beliefs about womanhood, insanity, poison, and respectability seriously without surrendering to them completely. The very durability of the case is one of the final ethical challenges. Stories that survive do so because each generation finds something usable in them. The chocolate poisoner label is vivid, memorable, and nearly impossible to forget. But vivid labels can overdetermine a life. They compress years of social formation, emotional distortion, legal contradiction, and institutional aftermath into a single Gothic phrase. That compression is efficient. It is not wholly truthful. A fuller account must reopen what the label closes. Perhaps the most honest ending a historian can offer is not mastery but scale. Christiana Edmunds was not an allegory, though contemporaries and later writers have often treated her as one. She was a woman formed within a particular class and gender order, caught within a destructive fixation, capable of calculated harmful acts, and later confined within an institution designed to manage lives that unsettled legal and moral categories. The archive does not dissolve her into clarity. It leaves edges rough. That roughness is not a defect to be repaired with flourish. It is part of the case itself. To retell such a story, then, is to accept both burden and limit. The burden is to be exacting, proportionate, and unseduced by the easy pleasures of shock. The limit is that some things will remain unresolved. The full texture of private thought, the precise progression from grievance to indiscriminate danger, the extent to which diagnosis captured or concealed what was happening in her mind. Responsible history does not pretend these questions can be answered once and for all. It keeps them visible. In that visibility lies a different kind of seriousness, quieter than sensation but more durable. Chapter 21. Why the story endures. Some crimes survive in memory because the scale of death is large. Others survive because the method is singular, the offender improbable, or the symbolic breach unusually sharp. Christiana Edmunds endures for all of these smaller reasons at once. The number of victims was not immense when set against the century's other tragedies, yet the case persists with unusual tenacity. The persistence has less to do with body count than with form. A respectable woman, chocolates, children, obsession, Broadmoor. Each element carries cultural charge. Together they create a narrative that later generations feel they already recognize even before they know the details. The case arrives half-made for retelling. Part of that durability lies in its resistance to clean moral sorting. Modern audiences often want historical crime to deliver one of two satisfactions. Either the offender is a comprehensible villain, cold and calculating, or she is a tragic patient destroyed by untreated illness and restrictive social conditions. Edmunds frustrates both scripts. The evidence suggests deliberate action. The record also suggests a mind that had become dangerously distorted. This ambiguity does not weaken the story. It renews it. Each retelling can tilt the balance differently, finding fresh emphasis in wickedness, madness, repression, or social failure. Because no single frame settles the case remains open to reuse. The image of poisoned confectionery also gives the story a peculiar portability. It can be told as domestic Gothic, as courtroom drama, as medical history, as the history of retail trust, as an account of female obsession, or as a study of Victorian responses to insanity. Few cases move so easily between genres. This flexibility helps explain why Edmunds appears in writing that is otherwise quite dissimilar in tone and purpose. She belongs at once to the archive and to popular imagination. Historians, journalists, and casual enthusiasts all find in the case something that seems to belong to their own mode of storytelling. Another reason the story endures is that it speaks to anxieties that did not disappear with the Victorians. Modern life still depends on goods consumed at a distance from their making, on trust in labels and sellers, on public health regulation, and on the assumption that ordinary transactions are mostly safe. Modern readers may not buy sweets from a Brighton confectioner, but they understand immediately the horror of harm delivered through a familiar object. They also recognize the discomfort of cases in which intimacy, mental disorder, and deliberate violence overlap. The 19th century feels near here, not remote. There is, however, a danger in endurance. Repetition can fossilize a case into cliché. The chocolate poisoner becomes a marketable tag. The woman herself becomes an icon of female monstrosity or female suffering. The actual historical pressures that shaped her life are smoothed away. What remains is a silhouette, memorable, dramatic, and thin. Recovering substance requires slowing down the story until its convenience begins to fall apart. That slower pace reveals not only Edmunds, but the society that produced and managed her. A society of regulated poisons and unreliable trust, rigid gender roles and emotional secrecy, expanding consumer culture and uncertain psychiatric authority. The endurance of the case therefore says as much about readers as it does about Edmunds. People return to such stories because they offer a controlled encounter with instability. One can peer into obsession, contamination, and moral disorder from the safety of hindsight. Yet the best historical work on crime should do more than gratify curiosity. It should return us to the structures that make the case meaningful. In Edmunds' story, those structures are unusually clear: respectability as camouflage, desire as grievance, commerce as vulnerability, law as partial answer, confinement as unresolved ending. If the story continues to be told, it should be because it helps illuminate those structures rather than because it provides a convenient Victorian villainess. The case is durable. That is all the more reason to handle it with care. Enduring stories are not automatically important in the right ways. They become important when retelling deepens understanding rather than merely polishing the old shock. Christiana Edmunds still unsettles because her life sits at the junction of personal disturbance and social form. That junction has not vanished. It is one reason the poison chocolates continue to cast such a long shadow. Conclusion. What remains when the walls are closed? The story of Christiana Edmunds resists the tidy endings we often expect from true crime. There is no moment of redemption, no final revelation that reframes her actions as either wholly monstrous or tragically innocent. There is only a long arc of containment, legal, medical, and cultural, and the quiet persistence of a mind that never conceded the wrong it had done. Victorian England answered Edmunds with walls. High ones. Purpose-built ones. Walls that promised safety without requiring understanding. In doing so, it solved the immediate problem while preserving the assumptions that had allowed the problem to form. That respectable women were harmless, that silence equaled virtue, and that obsession could be managed so long as it remained unseen. The verdict of guilty but insane did important work. It spared Edmunds the gallows. It spared the public the spectacle of a woman executed for poisoning children. It spared the profession of medicine, and the men within it, prolonged scrutiny. And it spared society the discomfort of admitting that a woman who reasoned clearly and lived quietly could still be capable of indiscriminate harm. But it also fixed Edmunds in a permanent category from which there was no return. Broadmoor did not cure her. It did not meaningfully engage with the reasoning that underpinned her actions. It neutralized her capacity to act by removing her from the world. For 36 years, she lived within a system that mistook stability for recovery and compliance for insight. She adapted. She endured. She remained convinced. That endurance matters. It tells us that Edmunds' danger did not lie in chaos or confusion, but in coherence, in a moral logic developed in isolation and protected by social assumptions. Her story reminds us that violence is not always the product of breakdown. Sometimes it is the outcome of ideas allowed to harden without challenge. What makes this case enduring is not the poison but the permission. Permission granted by a culture that trained women to internalize rather than articulate distress. Permission granted by institutions that preferred diagnosis to dialogue. Permission granted by a society more comfortable removing an anomaly than interrogating its origins. Christiana Edmunds was not created by one obsession alone. She was shaped by education that sharpened thought without granting agency, by independence that provided time without purpose, by respectability that shielded scrutiny, and by silence that encouraged interpretation over confrontation. When her private logic finally entered public space, it did so through a method that required trust, and exploited it. If this book has a warning, it is not about chocolate or poison. It is about the quiet spaces where harm is imagined long before it is enacted. About the risks of confusing composure with safety, about what happens when inner lives grow elaborate in the absence of honest resistance. Edmunds does not fit neatly into our modern categories either. She unsettles contemporary distinctions between illness and responsibility, obsession and entitlement, restraint and danger. She asks us to consider whether some forms of risk are amplified, not reduced, by social approval. In the end, Christiana Edmunds did not vanish because her story lacked meaning. She vanished because it demanded too much of those who encountered it. It asked for sustained attention, uncomfortable questions, and a willingness to look beyond labels. This conclusion does not offer closure. It offers responsibility. To remember that the most dangerous assumptions are often the most polite ones, and that silence, when mistaken for virtue, can be as consequential as any act of violence. That is what remains when the walls are closed.